As much as I would love to go into this entire video without mentioning Avatar: The Last Airbender to let the legend of Korra stand on its own, the more I get into researching and writing this script, the more I understand that such a thing is impossible to any recounting of the series that intends to be complete. It isn't as though the showrunners themselves intended for Korra to be a standalone show anyways. It draws heavily enough from the earlier source material as to make that show considered necessary watching for this one. I have a video on Avatar: The Last Airbender already on this channel, but I'll at least try to make sure that that video is not a necessary prerequisite for this one. But going back to the above point, The Legend of Korra not only attempts to continue and expand upon the story of the first series, but intends to do so in a way as to appeal to the original demographic, nearly a decade later. As such, the show moves on to more mature themes and makes a stronger attempt at writing plots in such a way as to appeal to a demographic who might better relate to and understand these new themes. Avatar: The Last Airbender was a show that had a hefty amount of respect for its audience in that it presented complex moral situations and characters that so many other shows for the same demographic would have strayed away from, as many assumed that preteens would not be able to understand anything more than a black and white system of morality with easily signposted good and bad guys. So in this, we were promised a darker and edgier series than what came before, with all the potential hazards that writing a story with this intention carries with it. Actively trying to be edgy can make a story come across as trying too hard, or including melodrama where it doesn't fit, detracting from the entire story. And it's being built on a foundation that did not require much in the way of expansion in these domains. Aang struggled with moral complications through his entire journey, so it's not as though this expansion to a more adult genre was really necessary to add complexity to these themes. But all of this is so far speculative. It requires a more thorough look at the show to really decide whether these claims are justified or not. I will be looking at The Legend of Korra on an episode-by-episode basis, splitting episode retrospectives into 3 sections: recap, review, and wrap-up. Recap is a general retelling of the most important plot beats of the episode, review covers the details of that episode thematically, and wrap-up is anything I couldn't find another place for. And of course, as I mentioned before, Avatar: The Legend of Korra is a show that attempts to take a darker look at the Avatar-verse, and so the show and this retrospective will showcase some of these darker themes, though it's worth mentioning that the show still aired on Nickelodeon during daytime hours, so there's nothing following this warning that truly warrants a more thorough disclaimer. Book 1: Air. Keeping with the water, earth, and fire naming conventions of the original series, The Legend of Korra begins with the element that Aang did not spend a season mastering, simultaneously highlighting the differences between him and his successor. Korra was quick to master 3 of the 4 elements, but struggles with the remaining responsibilities of the Avatar. She's quick to start a fight and quick to finish one, the opposite of Aang. And so the problems she faces are problems uniquely suited to her weaknesses as a person. One can imagine Aang easily dismantling the equalist struggle through conversation, inviting him on to an open dialogue about inequalities in the community, and thus reducing the amount of support he receives, as his messaging has always relied on the uncaring nature of the benders who run society. One can likewise imagine Korra confronting the Fire Nation's invasion head-on. Aang ran away and became frozen for 100 years, allowing the invading army to advance without much resistance. Stories are best when they highlight what the characters involved are bad at fixing, when the drama is increased by forcing flawed people to acknowledge their shortcomings, then working to overcome them. Just as the issues faced in the Equalist Rebellion are dissimilar to the issues faced by the Fire Nation invasion, Korra and Aang are likewise opposites, because who would be interested in seeing the same plot play out again and again? Welcome to Republic City. The episode begins with a young Korra being scouted as the potential new Avatar, showing a mastery of water, earth, and firebending. It skips to her as a young adult, showing off her masteries only to be told that she still has a long way to go in understanding the spiritual side of bending, as well as showing no talent for airbending. And after learning that the only airbending master, Tenzin, Aang and Katara's son, has to return to Republic City to serve as a councilman, Korra sneaks aboard a cargo ship to follow him there, so that she might learn more about airbending. but upon arriving in the city, she gets into an argument with the local equalist movement about the oppression done by Benders, and destroys a few buildings while fighting some gang members, resulting in her arrest by the local police force, led by Captain Beifong, Toph's daughter. Ultimately, Tenzin frees her and takes responsibility for her actions, deciding against sending her back to the safety of her South Pole home and the guardianship of the White Lotus, and instead agrees to have her begin her responsibilities as the Avatar, guiding the people of Republic City as she trains. The episode ends with Amon, the leader of the Equalist movement, learning of Korra's arrival and accelerating his unseen plot. This episode contains a moment where the torch is passed from the old Team Avatar to the new generation of characters. Katara herself is the one to deem that, while Aang is long gone, his legacy lives on, and that it's Korra's job to continue this. This serves as a remark not only about the characters in-universe, but outside the show itself, letting the audience prepare themselves for a new setting and new conflicts. A few other conflicts, such as Korra's lack of spirituality and the Equalist movement within Republic City, also get set up, though given less screen time than establishing the new setting of the show, as well as the central character of Korra. Korra serves as an opposite to Aang, a character who is much more enthusiastic about her role of being the Avatar, and much faster to rush into her new responsibilities. While Aang was self-conscious and tried to flee his responsibilities leading to getting frozen for 100 years, Korra is much more eager to show off her title, aggressively entering the city with no regard for if she's really ready or not. And her first public appearance shows that she is not truly prepared for what it is that she needs to do. Korra is physically strong and has mastered 3 of the 4 elements that she needs to, but these are irrelevant facts when put into the context of what it is that she actually has to do. Her power overwhelms the Triad gang members that she beats up, but also destroys a few buildings in the process, making the situation worse than what would have occurred had she stayed out of it. There's a complaint about this series, that many of the things that Aang spent the entire first series working hard to get were things that Korra started out with, but this only helps out the strength of the narrative. Many of the spiritual connections Aang started the series with are things that Korra lacks, and these are the traits of a person better suited to the role of Avatar within the Republic City. A leaf in the wind. Korra begins her proper training with Tenzin, but struggles to learn even the basics of airbending from him. Her interests lie more in following the pro-bending circuit than her lessons on meditation. Despite Tenzin's insistence that she avoid paying attention to those things, she sneaks out anyway to watch a match at the stadium, where she's found by Bolin, one of the competitors, who takes her backstage assuming she's a fan. After watching a match with Bolin and his brother Mako, she asks Bolin to teach her some of his earthbending moves, the brothers learning that she's the Avatar in the process. When their team, the Fire Ferrets, is short a member, the brothers ask Korra to substitute in for their match. But it takes a while for her to learn the intricacies of the rules, and she's not a great replacement. It isn't until Tenzin overhears a radio broadcast about her bending that he rushes over to scold her, after which she starts to adopt some of the airbending training she's received into her kit to win the match. Ultimately, Tenzin relents, acknowledging that the more practical lessons taught in the pro-bending circuit might help her Avatar training, and she's allowed to join the team outright. The first series made a consistent point that one's ability with a certain school of bending was more or less directly tied to their emotional ties to the element. As mentioned in this episode, Aang repeatedly failed at earthbending due to his inability to stay solid and strong-willed like a rock. He was too engrossed in the culture of the Airbenders to do much more than let himself be blown around. Korra here is much more concerned with raw strength, and is motivated to show that talent off, not the kind of person to show restraint in her dealings with the elements or other people. She's gotten into trouble over this before, and now it's showing itself in her inability to airbend. And yet she's finally able to make the connection that one element can tie into another as she receives a practical application of her skills and abilities. Being a better airbender makes her a more effective waterbender, and her earthbending skills are enhanced by knowing other elements, and so on. And of course, Korra's personality makes her a very hands-on learner for better and for worse. She struggles with capturing the essence of airbending through the lessons on meditation Tenzin gives her, but once she gets a practical lesson in the fundamentals, is able to quickly pick up on what to do. This works for Korra for now, but as the show progresses, the absence of this spirituality will start to show its faults. The Revelation. After finding out the Fire Ferrets need to raise money in order to participate in the next round of their bending matches, Mako and Bolin head out to find some way to get the funds they need. Mako joining a power plant, and Bolin getting roped into the criminal underworld that he and his brother used to be a part of. When Mako realizes his brother is missing, he teams up with Korra to track him down, learning that he's been kidnapped and taken to an equalist rally for something called the Revelation. Korra and Mako sneak into this rally, where they meet Amon, the leader of the movement, who claims he has the ability to permanently remove a person's bending ability, a much more permanent version of the temporary chi blocking that his minions are capable of. He shows off this ability a few times on some of the gang members he's captured, leading up to Bolin. So Korra and Mako create a plan to form a screen of steam and rescue their teammate, rushing away from the Equalist as Amon tells them to allow her to go free, that she'll be the messenger for what he has to say. Mako finds some work in this episode at a power plant, lightning bending to power the city. It's a role that can only be played by a bender, something similar to many of the other, more accelerated methods of development the Avatarverse has undergone relative to our world. But it's a form of work that's only available to a bender, meaning that this sort of entry-level job is something that most of the population is completely incapable of doing due to the circumstances of their birth. So far, the story of The Last Airbender and Legend of Korra have largely focused not only on the groups of benders, but prodigies at their craft. The new tone of this series begins to ask questions about the universe from a more realistic angle. What really happens in a society where a small portion of the population is granted great powers? As for that great power, we can see advancements not only in society, but in how bending is taught and spread among the people there. Lightning bending used to be something extraordinarily rare. Only a select few were capable of such a thing, and it took years of careful practice to achieve. The same can be said of metal bending, as well as so many of the now mundane implementations. This is a result of Aang's actions up to the point of the series' beginning. With more connectivity between the nations, more advanced forms of bending are simple to teach. Much in the same way that a teenager's knowledge of chemistry today far outweighs the knowledge of chemistry of someone 100 years ago, when education was much more of a privilege to receive. So too is the technological advancement in the 70 years between the two series, although this becomes less of a stretch when you consider the real-world leap in technology over a similar time frame. 70 years is much longer than the time it took for our world to go from the Wright brothers' first flight to the moon landing. The Voice in the Night. Mako is struck by a cyclist while out, who reveals herself to be Asami Sato, the daughter of Hiroshi Sato, the industrialist responsible for the invention of the Satomobile seen around the city. She invites him out on a date due to being a fan of the Fire Ferrets, and after a meeting with her father, the group is given a sponsorship to continue competing in the pro-bending circuit, as well as sparking a relationship between Mako and Asami, something Korra resents, though she has other things on her mind, such as her fear of Amon and his ability to take away bending. This fear drives her to reject the call to join a task force dedicated to rooting out the Equalists at first, though she eventually resolves to face her fears directly after a group of journalists accost her at a party hosted by Tarlok, another member of the council. After a few missions rooting out Amon's followers, Korra finally decides to publicly call him out and challenge him to a one-on-one duel, though he doesn't show up at first, leading Korra to let her guard down when she's assaulted by a group of chi blockers. After her capture, Korra is told that he intends to remove her bending last, so as not to make her into a martyr, then leaves her there. After being recovered by Tenzin, Korra finally breaks down and admits she's afraid. Korra at first avoids a confrontation with Amon and his Equalist group, something done out of fear from her perspective but aligning with the wishes of Tenzin. He does not want a task force created to directly fight the Equalists, as his fear is that this could lead to the creation of martyrs within the group. To respond to an ideology with violence will only drive more people towards that group, as it makes the group being rebelled against come across as the antagonist, more aggressive than those they're attempting to silence. Tenzin hopes to take the high road by using the moral high ground to make the disparity between benders and non-benders seem less encompassing, but to Korra and the rest of the city, this is viewed as cowardice, something Korra's internalized through her fear of Amon's ability to remove bending. And this fear is compounded by the fact that, so far, Korra has defined herself by her bending abilities as the Avatar. She approaches problems with raw strength, using her bending to fight her way out of issues. This raw strength comes in exception of the more spiritual aspects of what the Avatar is meant to be, and here the problem is finally put into a proper light. there are some issues in the world that raw strength alone cannot fix, and can only exasperate, and so the role of Avatar is not to answer might with might, but to resolve the issues on an ideological level, not just to bring a balance to the four elements, but a balance between benders and non-benders as well. The spirit of competition. When Asami gives the Fire Ferrets their new uniforms, Korra starts to feel a sense of jealousy about the relationship between her and Mako. And after asking the other Airbenders for some romantic advice, she decides it's best to confess her feelings, only to get rejected. But when Bolin asks her out, she decides to spend the evening with him instead, meeting a rival team at a noodle shop and having some not-so-friendly banter. But this love triangle starts a feud within the team, their performance suffering as a result, and when Mako tries to confront Korra about this, he ends up admitting that he has feelings for her. The two kiss in front of Bolin, who runs off sobbing about the treachery. The next match goes terribly, though after Bolin and Mako are knocked out together, they have a talk where the two agree that, as brothers, they won't let something like this get between them. Korra manages to pull off a reverse sweep, and the team advances to the finals, with the four putting the romantic snafu aside. This episode serves as a breather before the rest of the seasonal plot kicks in. No mention of the Equalists or Amon, as the only things resolved are issues arising due to love triangles, quadrilaterals, or whatever shape formed by the cast thus far. One of the longest-lasting cultural impacts of the original Avatar series was shipping discussion, so this was naturally something that had to be brought up in the next series. Even long after the show stopped airing and began to leave the public's consciousness, shipping discussion persisted, and with the aging up of the cast for The Legend of Korra, there was equally a desire to have more subplots that could take advantage of this. As for these subplots, they largely exist from a lack of communication, the way many romantic issues in media often arise. Most of the characters' problems with one another are the result of putting their own feelings in the place of someone else's. Mako feels upset about dating Asami when he has feelings for Korra, assuming correctly that she might become jealous as a result. Bolin asks out Korra, not considering whether this will cause any conflict between her and his brother. And Asami remains out of the loop for most of this episode, unaware of the hurt feelings her presence may have caused. It's not until the characters involved actually bother to talk things out that they realize their animosity was misplaced, and the episode can end with a more optimistic tone. And the winner is... The episode begins with the Fire Ferrets training for their finals match against the Wolf Bats, only for a radio broadcast by Amon to demand that the Pro Bending Games be shut down. The city council plans to give in to the command for safety, but Korra attempts to persuade them otherwise, backed up by Chief Beifong. The match is held anyway with additional security measures in place, and the Wolf Bats cheat their way through, bribing the judges and making several fouls. Despite an attempt to counter the cheating, the Fire Ferrets are knocked out, and the victory goes to the Wolf Bats, though the celebrations are interrupted by an Equalist assault, knocking out much of the security and breaking in through the glass roof to debend the champions. Korra and Lin attempt to chase down Amon as he's escaping, but barely miss their chance to pursue. The arena has several Equalist sigils thrown about before the bending arena is destroyed and Amon escapes, Tenzin stating that the city is now in an open war. Amon's plan involves a show of force in overpowering the will of Republic City. If they gave in to his demand to shut down the games, it would show that he has the force to push the council around. If they do not, he launches an attack to prove the same point anyway. Korra has, since the beginning of the series, been the type to rush in head-on, to use force to solve her conflicts. Amon's showing of power uses the same philosophy, merely executed in a much more effective way. The Equalists are more numerous than the Benders, though they're the stronger group in terms of physical power. And of course he also tries to make this same point in a less physical way, arguing philosophically that bending is outdated, and that it only serves to divide people. While Aang was originally able to found Republic City on the idea of not only being inclusive to all cultures, but the non-benders as well, Aang is no longer around and his ideas have worn out with him. This plot then is only possible because of a new avatar being in play, one who lacks the experience and wisdom in resolving issues that her previous incarnation had. In a way, Korra's existence has indirectly kicked off these plots, and it's a matter of her growing into the role that will determine whether or not she can fix the issue. The Aftermath. Following the destruction of the bending arena where Bolin and Mako were living, they're invited to live with Asami in the Sato mansion despite Korra's offer to live at the Air Temple. But while Asami is showing them around, Korra overhears her father, Hiroshi, discussing the recent seizure of Equalist supplies from a rival corporation, causing her to suspect that he may have ties to the Equalist movement. While searching one of his warehouses, they get a clue from an informant that there's a secret factory beneath the mansion that produces weapons. Korra and Chief Beifong follow this lead, but Mako believes that Korra's just trying to damage the Sato family's name out of jealousy, especially since Hiroshi has been forthcoming with allowing the police to investigate him in the first place. But in spite of this, they search underground and eventually find tunnels, leading them to a cache of weapons including some new mechs, made out of platinum and thus non-bendable. The informant had led them into a trap, and Sato Industries prepares to kidnap the Avatar and the police chief to Amon, but Asami stops her father and helps the Benders to flee back to Air Temple Island. This episode gives more characterization to Asami, who so far has served as a sort of tertiary character who exists to drive drama between Mako and Korra, rather than as a person. As she shows the fire ferrets around her family's property, she explains more about her backstory, and starts to finally establish a dynamic with other characters beyond Mako's girlfriend. More of her backstory is given through exposition alongside her father, that her mother was killed by a gang of firebenders, giving Hiroshi the motivation to side with the Equalists, and giving her the same reasons for going along with him. But ultimately, Asami doesn't. She spent the last several episodes alongside the Benders that her father hates so much, humanizing them just as this episode's plot has developed her own character. So for Asami to learn about her father's true intentions puts his motivations up against her own. She knows Benders personally, and thus doesn't have her thoughts clouded by revenge, as she's able to compartmentalize the good as separate from the bad. Just as not all non-Benders are a part of the Equalist movement, not all Benders have to be considered culpable for any perceived oppression. When extremes meet. After settling in on Air Temple Island, Korra and friends attend the swearing-in of the new chief of police, Saikon, a puppet of Tarlok's who turns over all Equalist investigations to the council member. Korra announces her refusal to work with the man, and he taunts her back by pointing out how lacking she is as an avatar, something she discusses with Tenzin on the return trip as he points out that perhaps she needs to form a stronger connection with her past lives, through meditation. Eventually, Korra decides to group up with Bolin, Mako, and Asami to form the new Team Avatar, mimicking the group from the past. But while out capturing Equalist forces faster than the police can, they learn of a new law, a curfew for non-Benders that also treats every one of them as the enemy. While protesting their power being cut off, a gathering of these non-Benders is mass arrested, including Bolin, Asami, and Mako. So Korra goes directly to the councilman in charge to protest his new decision and breaks out into a fight. And just as it seems like Korra's overpowered her foe, Tarlok reveals a new trick, that he is a bloodbender, an art he uses to capture Korra, ending the episode. At the start of the series, Korra was the type of person to charge head-on into her problems, to try and solve as much with might as possible. But over the first half of this season, she steadily learned that that approach does not always work, and that some things need to be done in a more legitimate fashion, or to resolve differences without violence. Yet as of now, she hasn't quite pieced together how to accomplish this sort of peacemaking. She only knows what not to do. This doesn't make her an expert at diplomacy yet. It's implied that this is tied heavily to the spiritual side of what the Avatar is meant to be capable of. Aang was quick to make peace between warring factions, even in the early seasons of The Last Airbender, but struggled with facing a foe who only responded to a show of strength, and now Korra faces the opposite problem. In her character development so far though, she's managed to avoid falling into pitfalls that would have gotten her before. Tarlok sets up a task force dedicated to eradicating the Equalist forces, and goes about his responsibilities in a very heavy-handed manner, something that matches the same level of aggression that Korra herself once exhibited. The fact that she's now enemies with a person who is using her own methods, at least outwardly, is a sign of her growth, but the fact that she could be defeated by this foe as well also shows how much growth is still necessary. Out of the past. After kidnapping Korra, Tarlok fabricates a story about the Equalist forces ambushing him in his office, and that they took her instead. Tenzin, Lin, and the rest of the new Team Avatar seek out an Equalist base to find her, as well as the men of the police force who formerly worked under Chief Beifong. But despite managing to break the others out, they find no trace of Korra, except for an interrogated soldier who says that Tarlok fabricated the story. Upon confronting him, his secrets are revealed by his secretary, including the fact that he's a bloodbender. Tarlok escapes and tries to track down Korra, relocating her to use as a hostage to negotiate for his life. But upon arriving back at the mountain hideaway where she's being held, he finds Amon waiting for him, upset that the councilman's been disgraced and taking away his bending as a punishment. Meanwhile, Korra has been meditating on her past lives, discovering that Tarlok is the son of Yakone, another bloodbender who once tried to rule Republic City, with his powers only to be thwarted by Aang in the Avatar state. When Amon tries to take her, she fakes being incapacitated to escape into the mountains, where Naga takes her back to the city and her friends. Korra has always struggled to make a connection with her past lives, one of the key components needed to accelerate her growth in the field of spirituality. Despite the guidance through meditations led by Tenzin, she's only ever managed to make small visions appear without much context, and even these only appear during moments of danger, such as the attack on the pro-bending arena. This is consistent with the previous series, that Aang has been closest to communicating with his past lives during specific circumstances or when he's in danger. This is how the Avatar state is triggered until he's able to control it much later. And then this too is consistent with Korra's upbringing. She's complained before about growing up in a compound, being trained for most of her life while naive to the outside world. This lack of danger in her childhood has prevented her from ever activating the Avatar state and from being closer to her past lives. She never really needed them up to this point, but now that the series has taken on a much more urgent tone, her growth has accelerated. It's common for a person to remain stagnant as long as their life is simple and free from complications, with only the struggles we face forcing us to undergo any sort of change. And this is a theme present in The Last Airbender as much as it is present in The Legend of Korra. Turning the tides. While Korra is recovering on Air Temple Island, Asame begins to have a conversation with Mako about his feelings for her, a conversation he doesn't want any part of. Meanwhile, Lin has agreed to stay with Tenzin's family to protect them while he returns to the city to perform his duties, something made impossible by an equalist attack on the council members, resulting in all but him being subdued. Tenzin is able to send a wire to the United Forces before the police headquarters are overrun, forcing him to retreat to Air Temple Island when he learns his family is in danger, and barely escaping due to intervention from Team Avatar. This invasion is held off by Lin for a while, with the children rushing in to help her while Pima gives birth, but despite backup arriving, they still have to plan on escaping. The Avatar and her friends go into hiding while Tenzin takes his family to safety. Their plan is to lie in wait for the United Forces to arrive, and then to join in afterwards. But Lin is captured while trying to defend Tenzin, and after being taken to Amon directly, she has her bending taken away. The primary purpose of this episode is to move pieces into place for the season's finale, something necessitated by the much more standardized formula The Legend of Korra uses compared to The Last Airbender, a show that already eschewed the typical standalone episode formula many of the cartoons of the era used. As such, there's not too much that this episode can do in terms of theming or establishing any sort of message beyond several fight scenes. These fight scenes take up a majority of the episode. It does show a major difference between the amount of attention this show gives to its action compared to before. With an older audience comes more of a focus on action over dialogue, and what few moments of respite this episode has are mostly dedicated to romantic subplots. These come about in the form of Asame's issues with Mako, not so much that he kissed Korra, but the fact that he didn't tell Asame about this incident, a betrayal of her trust. We're yet to see precisely what kind of effect this might have on their relationship, as the rest of the Equalist invasion takes priority during the plot, and thus far it doesn't seem to have much of an effect on their ability to work together. But the seeds have been planted and are brought up just enough to keep the idea in the audience's mind. Skeletons in the closet. Team Avatar is staying in Republic City's underground alongside the homeless and those unconcerned with Amon's revolution as they await the arrival of the United Forces. But when reinforcements arrive, they're ambushed by a combination of mines and biplanes, sinking most of the fleet and leaving them powerless to resist Amon's control of the city. So Admiral Iroh II works with Korra to send a signal to the next wave of ships, telling them to wait for an all-clear. The plan is to destroy the airfield the Equalists have set up so the ships can arrive with impunity. But Korra gets the urge to face Amon directly at Air Temple Island, donning an Equalist costume to face him and bringing Mako as backup. But instead of Amon, they find Tarlok in a cell, and he tells them the story of Amon's upbringing. Tarlok and Amon were brothers, raised by their father Yakone to become powerful enough bloodbenders to overthrow Republic City as revenge for the Avatar taking his bending away. But Amon, now Talk at the time, refused to fight his own brother for training and ran away from home, only for Yakone to die without realizing his revenge. Now armed with the knowledge that Amon is a bender, Korra and Mako changed their plan, not to fight him directly, but to expose his backstory and turn the people who follow him against their leader. This episode reveals Amon's motivation for his hatred of benders. The inequality he feels in society does not purely come as a result of the mistreatment of non-benders, but the heightened expectations placed on benders themselves due to their abilities. Being treated like a tool in another person's revenge was a part of Amon's early childhood, his bending abilities being developed alongside an emotional state of turmoil. So every time he sees bending itself, he can only think of the mistreatment he has had as a child. But these very personal reasons end up overlooking the facts of the situation. The world of Avatar is one marked by a rapid increase in the level of technology, purely because of the different cultures that have come together in Republic City, and differing philosophies that have strengthened one another as a result. This was a recurring theme in The Last Airbender, that Aang's circle of friends included people from all over the world, and that it was stronger as a result. So to view bending as a pure evil makes Amon come across as hyper-focused on his own poor experiences, rather than the potential for good, meaning that Korra's victory will have to be a moral one, not simply overpowering the guy. Endgame. Korra and Mako reveal Amon's history at an Equalist rally, though he removes his mask to show his scars, causing the assembly there to doubt the validity of Korra's revelation. But when Amon threatens to debend Tenzin and his captured family, she and Mako rush the stage, fighting Amon into a corner where he's able to bloodbend and capture Korra, removing her ability to bend. But after trying to escape, he's about to debend Mako too, only for Korra to hit him with a blast of air, revealing her ability to airbend for the first time. She blasts him out a window and into the water, with Amon waterbending his way out and revealing the painted-on scars as well as his bending abilities to the onlooking Equalists. So he retreats, taking Tarlok from captivity and fleeing back to the pole where he was raised, only for Tarlok to destroy their ship, ending the cycle of vengeance for good. Meanwhile, Asami and Bolin attack the airfield, with Iroh destroying a fleet of planes meant to attack the incoming United Forces ships. While there, they're stopped by Hiroshi, and Asami confronts him over his actions. As he's unapologetic, they end up working together to capture Asami's father. After the plot wraps up, Korra returns to her hometown, where Katara tries and fails to heal her bending block. But after a confession from Mako, she runs away to a glacier, where Aang and the rest of the previous avatars confront Korra and return her bending. Korra healing Lin afterwards, and finally returning Mako's affections. Hiroshi is put into comparison with Amon during this episode, both of the characters having similar backstories, albeit with Amon's a fabricated one, and having their personalities consumed by hatred as a result. Hiroshi, as his daughter points out, is so consumed by his hatred of benders that he's forgotten why he disliked them in the first place, his malice consuming the love he felt for his wife, to the point that his vengeance has nothing to do with his loved ones anymore. Meanwhile, Korra finally manages to unlock her airbending abilities, not through training, but through the defense of a person she loves. When her goals mostly consist of trying to fight against Amon or to become a better pro-bender, she never makes any progress in this art form. But her desire to protect others, one of the core aspects of being the Avatar, is what enables her to finally make the last bit of connection with her past lives, and thus enables her to bend air. The ending to this episode comes across as a bit rushed, so many things happening and resolving in short order, but as the explanation for these events came first, it only really feels like the pacing is off, rather than these developments coming out of nowhere. Korra gets the ability to airbend by making a spiritual connection to the Avatar state, finally understanding what it was that they all fought for. So to have the rest of her bending unlock itself by channeling Aang makes sense, as it was Aang's failure to decisively stop Yakone that led to the Equalist invasion. He's given the chance to finally finish what he started all those years ago. Book 2: Spirits. The first book of The Legend of Korra was originally approved as a standalone series, with the later episodes only being approved much later. This means that, contrary to the first season wrapping up as much as possible in the final episodes, the second season and onward would flow together more evenly, allowing for character arcs to continue on much longer than a single season. The next 3 books were also produced very closely together. Post-production work on Book 2 was being completed as pre-production on Book 4 was starting. As such, the plots are able to take on much grander stakes as they start to develop parts of the world setting that take longer to pay off and have more potential for what can be done, without feeling as though these changes are poorly planned out. The first Avatar and a fuller extent of the spiritual connections of that role get built up and begin to play a stronger role than what we've seen from the series before. But this circumstance to the show's creation wasn't entirely beneficial. With Book 1 being outlined as standalone, it managed to wrap up full character arcs that would then have to be built upon in the later books. As a result, it feels almost as if a few of the characters regress, unlearning the lessons taught to them before in order to facilitate more development, so that they remain interesting, while other characters are put on the sidelines, not really serving much of a role to the plots as they become less and less important. Korra can only learn to stop being so brash so many times before it gets tiring, and Mako nearly loses his character agency, being demoted to Korra's boyfriend for the first half of this season. Overall, Book 2 focuses on a few different aspects of what the show could be about, but as some of these are repeats of what development has come before, the show's quality then rests on what's new. Rebel Spirit. 6 months have passed since the finale of Book 1. Republic City now has an elected official, giving Tenzin more time to focus on training Korra in airbending. Mako has joined the police force, hoping to work his way up to detective. Bolin is struggling to keep the new members of the Fire Ferrets on top of their game. Asami is hoping to re-establish the reputation of future industries, after the equalist involvement of her father. And there's a large festival occurring in the Southern Water Tribe, one that's meant to celebrate the two tribes coming together. Unalaq, the Northern Water Tribe's leader, has come south to celebrate with his brother Tonrak, Korra's father, and leader of the Southern Water Tribe. But while visiting, he expresses his distaste for the festivities, stating that the festival was once a more secular holiday, and that the South, forgetting their connections to the spirits, is causing a series of attacks on ships in the nearby waters. One of these attacks strikes Korra and her friends as they're resting up after the festival, and when Unalaq manages to pacify the spirit, Korra is enthralled enough to decide to quit studying under Tenzin to study with a new spiritual leader instead. Meanwhile, Bolin manages to woo Eska, Unalaq's emotionless daughter, and Varric, a shipping tycoon Asami is hoping to work out a deal with. As the Avatar is meant to be the link between the spirit and physical worlds, the Avatar state is supposed to be a heightened state of this connection, and yet Korra is mostly using it to win races and for other trivial means. Even her Avatar state fails to defeat the rampaging spirit towards the end of the episode. Through this, she's aware that she lacks a certain connection to her responsibilities as an ambassador in this regard. She can toggle the Avatar state at will, but it's a weak version. Part of this is connected to how trivial many of the other heightened forms of bending have become. Lightning bending is much more commonplace, despite being exclusive to a few masters before. Metal bending is commonplace among the police as well, and so Korra's use of the Avatar state has gone from something unique to something more mundane. This is coupled with the revelation that the isolation during her childhood was not something mandated by Aang or any past Avatar, but her father and Tenzin hoping to protect her. An aspect of her life that she hasn't quite forgotten about. And while this is mostly in the interest in honing her abilities before allowing Korra to go out and make hasty mistakes, she also points out the experience is a much better teacher than training. This is how she was able to defeat Amon last season, and how her spiritual connection was made in the first place. But just because she can make these connections doesn't mean that she can make them wisely, and it's still likely that her enthusiasm to try new things could lead her into a trap. The Southern Lights. Tenzin and his family arrive at the Southern Air Temple and begin to tour around the place, taking a special interest in the past avatars. Meanwhile, Korra heads to the South Pole alongside Unalaq, with Mako and Tonrak following her for protection in spite of her protests, in order to open up a spirit portal during the solstice. As they head down there, Unalaq has his brother reveal the reason he was in the Southern Water Tribe instead of ruling in the North. He was a general years ago who flooded a spiritual ground while flushing out some raiders, and the resulting spirit attacks had him banished. Korra demands that he turn back because he kept this from her, and heads further south without her father. After fighting off a series of spirit attacks, she's finally able to head into the old forest alone, where she finds the spirit portal Unalaq mentioned, and opens it after entering the Avatar state. This results in the Aurora Borealis returning to the skies as they head home, only to find the Northern Water Tribe's fleet arriving in the harbor, as Unalaq mentions that returning spirituality to the south will take more than simply opening the portals. Avatar as a series has always stressed the importance of one's connection to the element that they're bending, with the personalities of benders often closely reflecting their element and containing a few of its core tenets. But the setting is no longer about four nations living in harmony and isolation, but about these ideals coming into close contact and blending together. Korra is somewhat thick-skulled and charges in to face problems head-on, despite coming from a water-bending family. Mako is calm and collected, despite being a firebender, and Bolin is more relaxed and laid back, in spite of the more theoretically surly personality of earthbenders. And this is, in part, why characters like Unalaq view the spiritual connections of the bending world to be weaker. As the Avatar, it's Korra's role not to facilitate one idea over any other, but to acknowledge and even cultivate these cultural mixtures. That one's bending can be enhanced by embracing different ideas can lead to a stronger synthesis of the best parts of each of them. Aang certainly understood this when founding Republic City, and that's largely why so many of the more advanced techniques of early times have become more commonplace. But this progress cannot be made blindly, and there's some value in considering why the old ways were as they were, if only to better understand why the progress is valuable. Civil Wars Part 1. Tenzin is trying to relax only to find out that Ikki has disappeared. He creates a search party with his siblings, Bumi and Kaya, to find his daughter, reminiscing on his childhood with them. But they don't share the same nostalgia as they point out the favoritism that Aang had for his airbender son. Meanwhile, tensions are rising between the Southern Water Tribe and the Northern occupiers, something that Unalaq deems necessary to protect the spirit portal that Korra opened in the previous episode, and he encourages her to focus her energy on opening the portal in the North Pole instead of thinking about the conflict. But her parents host a meeting where Varrick riles up the crowd of Southerners about the lack of trade that can go on with the naval blockade, and they plan to do something about it. Something Korra stops as she sees a group of masked men breaking into Unalaq's quarters to kidnap him. She stops the men, glad to see her father's not among them, and when Unalaq demands they be arrested, she instead talks him down to giving a public trial. But later, while making peace with her parents, Cinna and Tonrak are arrested by Northern forces for their supposed involvement in the conspiracy. One of Korra's biggest flaws as a character is an over-eagerness to fight things out, not to run away from conflict, and a headstrong approach to one side of an issue. But as the Avatar, it's also her responsibility to prevent conflicts of this nature from occurring in the first place. As these two ideals clash, she finds herself increasingly unable to prevent a war from escalating, her attempts to stay neutral only making things worse as the two sides get further and further at each other's throats while ignoring her pleas. Unalaq is aware that his occupation is poorly justified, but has Korra agreeing to see both sides of the argument. Meanwhile, the South is hoping for some end to the conflict but are unable to strike decisively as Korra tries to cool their tempers. When there's an injustice in the world, staying neutral often means complacency with the status quo, in this case, to side with the aggressor. This then creates a sense of irony from the fact that Korra is feuding with her father from sheltering her as a child. All she claims to have ever wanted was to be the Avatar, but being the Avatar means engaging in this sort of conflict resolution, the very thing she struggles to do. If it was purely a role of fighting bad guys, she would have what she wanted from the outset, but the reality of her life is far different than the things she resents her family for not allowing her to have. Civil Wars Part 2. Tenzin manages to find Ikki among a group of sky bison, who she's pretended are her new family. He talks a bit with her about his frustrations with his own siblings before taking her home, where the Airbenders make peace with their relatives. Back at the South Pole, Korra's family is on trial, and the judge presiding over the case gives the conspirators the death penalty, although Unalaq pleads with the judge to reduce the sentence to life in prison. But when Korra tracks down the judge later on, she threatens information out of him, learning that not only did Unalaq rig the trial and outcome to make himself look good, but that he did the same thing back when Tonrak was exiled, bribing the attacking raiders into using the forest for cover. So Korra and friends try to break her father out of jail, eventually commandeering a ship in order to chase down the vessel he's on, where they agree to start an all-out civil war. Korra's role in this conflict is to convince the United Forces to assist on the side of the South. Meanwhile, Bolin attempts to break up with the increasingly clingy Eska, only for her to demand a marriage out of him. When the war breaks out, he's relieved that he won't see her anymore until the group notices a spurned Eska chasing down their ship. Korra in this episode finally reaches a conclusion that the conflict is not an equal one, that avoiding a war isn't necessarily the best option all the time if one side is dead set on starting one anyway. While it's optimistic to imagine a world free of such conflicts, the next best thing is one in which such conflicts are snuffed out quickly, assuming they can't be contained before they begin. But upon seeing the jealousy and resentment Unalaq feels towards his brother, Korra realizes that any war one side is desperate to start is inevitable. You can't talk some people down. So her responsibility boils down to finishing the conflict as quickly as possible to minimize collateral damage, in this case, getting backup from the United Forces to force a more even stalemate. The B-plot of this episode involving Tenzin and Ikki mirrors the family drama that ultimately starts the larger plot, its siblings resentful of the special treatment the other one receives, and starting conflict that puts others and themselves in danger. And while Kaya, Bumi, and Tenzin never come anywhere near the scale of the civil war started by the jealous Unalaq, it still shows a possible solution, with the hurt party offering an apology and willingness to see things from the other person's perspective. But this is a two-way issue. It still stands that Unalaq may want much more than whatever it is he's claiming. Peacekeepers. Korra arrives in Republic City to participate in a protest by members of the Southern Water Tribe in spite of Mako's warnings that it may come across as her taking a side of the conflict. During this march, there's an attack on the Water Tribe's cultural center, and despite Mako doing some detective work to try to find out the real culprits, it's blamed on the North by most people, Korra included. But when she tries to take this information to Republic's president, he refuses to give military aid to the South, causing Korra to go behind his back to directly recruit assistance from the military itself. But Bolin lets this information slip to Mako while he's filming a propaganda film for Varric, who is also working alongside Asami to sell future industry tanks to the South, and Mako takes the information to the police's leadership when pressed for knowledge. This results in Korra's second plan to get aid being undermined by the president as well, and when she learns that Mako was the one to reveal it, she confronts him on the betrayal and the two break up. In the end, Korra tries to go to the Fire Nation for aid instead, only to be attacked by Unalaq's twins on the way, and later sunken by a water spirit. While Korra has just concluded that inaction is complacency with the aggressor in a situation, she still hasn't figured out that the opposite of a wrong thing isn't necessarily the right one. Korra's operating under the assumption that she has to protect the victims in the situation without considering if she has all the available information, something many of the people around her are also unsure of. And while the president and the police are choosing inaction due to their lack of information on the subject, Korra is going with her gut, and this is the option that leaves the most vulnerable to being exploited. Varric is making an active effort to escalate the conflict by selling military supplies, his bottom line being considered more valuable than any human cost, and he's able to manipulate others into thinking that going along with these sales makes them right, as that's precisely what they wanted to hear. Because Korra believes she's protecting people, she's willing to take extreme measures to fight back, assuming that the conflict is on a grander scale than it currently is. And while she's right about the gist of this, she still doesn't know enough of the details to know she's being manipulated, regardless of whether her heart is in the right place. The Sting. Mako is investigating another attack on a supply ship, this time hitting one of Future Industries' supply ships heading to the South Pole. From an interview with the ship's captain, he finds out that the ship was rocked by controlled explosions, which he links to the attack on the Water Tribe Cultural Center from last episode. He then plans on setting up a decoy ship to capture whoever's been launching these strikes, but without help from the police, he turns to his old Triad buddies for assistance. This trap ends up not being sprung, as Mako overhears that the gang members were paid twice to keep Mako and Asami distracted at sea, resulting in a race back to Republic City, where they find one of Future Industries' warehouses ransacked. Meanwhile, Bolin has been busy at work, misinterpreting his role as Nuktuk, the hero of the South, in Varric's propaganda film. When Mako approaches him looking for the industrialist, he instead notices the pyrotechnics on the set use the same detonation device he found at the scene of the earlier explosions, and realizes that Varric has been sabotaging the ships himself. When he tries to warn Asami of this fact, he shows up at her office just in time to learn that Varric has bought a controlling share of her company. Meanwhile, Korra washes up on an island surrounded by fire sages, only to reveal she has no memory of who she is. With Unalaq only appearing at the very beginning and Korra only appearing at the very end, this episode's focus primarily rests with Mako and Asami, as they investigate what's going on behind the scenes. The what of the Civil War takes a backseat as the why is given more clarity, and many of the characters who have had less to do thus far finally get their moment to follow a call to action, in a season that's otherwise been too packed for them to get much in the way of development. But in a less optimistic view, this episode takes very little of Korra's perspective. Having her presumed dead or missing for much of the plot means that everyone else gets to operate without her. After 5 episodes of Korra making everything worse, she's finally out of the picture long enough for Mako to start piecing things together, and for the plot to come around to making sense. Villain motives are revealed, and the extent of the manipulation going on behind the scenes is finally spelt out more explicitly. The main cast has been getting manipulated, culminating in a civil war starting alongside a takeover of future industries. One could also imagine this episode's low point as being the future without an avatar intervening, almost justifying Korra getting involved in the first place. Beginnings, Part 1. An unconscious Korra is brought by the Fire Sages to a pool where she is placed to meditate on her past lives to find Rava. There she meets Wan, the first avatar, and he tells her he will guide Korra to Rava. From there, the episode flashes back nearly 10,000 years, to the time when humans lived in isolated islands on the backs of lion turtles. Wan was a poor man living under the oppression of a family who hoarded all the food, something that could only be obtained by dangerous ventures into the spirit wilds outside their city. For protection, the lion turtles granted them the use of an element, under the condition that they return the power upon returning home. But when Wan sneaks his power back into the city to start a revolution, he's exiled from the safety of the walls and forced into the spirit wilds. There he's able to befriend the spirits, and eventually becomes accepted as one of them, his deeds at defending the spirits getting back to his home, where he inspires more Benders to attempt survival in the wilds. But later, after heading out to explore the rest of the world to find more cities, he comes across 2 giant spirits, destroying the land as they battle, and he fights off the light one. But the remaining spirit reveals itself as Rava, the spirit fighting for life, and that Wan's actions liberated Vaatu, the spirit of darkness. In a mirror of the season's plot up to this point, an imbalance in the harmony of the universe is made at the fault of the current/future avatar. Wan, freeing Vaatu from the grasp of Rava, sets in motion a series of disasters that threaten all life as the characters know it. This is mirrored in Korra's actions, as she too is manipulated by a villainous force in order to cause a greater conflict while believing she's defending the victim. And while calling Vaatu strictly evil is an oversimplification, this is merely the perspective given by the show thus far. Wanting to wipe out all life is seen as an overreaction to a potential conflict caused by the light spirit liberating the people of the lion turtles into declaring war on each other whenever they're not attacking other spirits. By setting up this conflict in comparison to Korra's manipulation at the hands of Unalaq, we get the next episode to follow up not only on the story, but themes as well. The answer to the issue will come in the story's revolution in the following part. Beginnings, Part 2. This episode continues with the conflict between Vaatu and Rava, now working together with Wan. Wan travels the world to find the rest of the cities, and in the process, obtain the other bending styles so he can help out the Light Spirit in the upcoming Harmonic Convergence, the day the two will fight again. As he's wandering the spirit wilds, he sees that the spirits have become more aggressive and hostile, attacking the people even in their homes atop the lion turtles. He unites with Rava briefly to use multiple elements at once in spite of the physical danger this presents to him, at first able to fight off the attacking spirits, and later able to hold off the humans from his home city when they get into conflict with other spirits. But as he's incapable of maintaining the form of the avatar for long, this fighting happens anyway, the chaos feeding Vaatu to make him more powerful. Despite his failures, Wan attempts to guide Rava to the side of the Harmonic Convergence so they might attempt to fight against darkness in spite of her weakened state. The fight goes poorly at first until he connects with a spirit portal and is able to permanently fuse with the light spirit, creating the first avatar. Vaatu is sealed away, and Rava/Wan separate the humans and the spirit world to prevent further fighting, dedicating the rest of his life and his next lives to preventing conflict between the tribes of humans that have formed. While the light and dark spirits were in a stalemate, the world was on shaky ground, implied to be stagnant. Humans lived in isolated communities and spirits surrounded them in dangerous territory. When light began to shine through a human, Wan was able to inspire the people to leave their homes and to create more than what they had had before. This lightness becomes the spirit of creation and development, a sort of industry that can push humankind forwards, but this also comes at the cost of spirituality. The spiritual cost is then offset by the Avatar, a position that is dedicated to tempering human development. Juan, at first, has to prevent direct fighting between the spirits and humans, as their destruction of nature was one of their first directives following the discovery of a new home, something as present 10,000 years ago as it's seen to be during the time of the Avatar The Last Airbender, when the Fire Nation's technological advancement gave way to their invasion of the rest of the world and the ensuing chaos. It's also seen during the present in-universe as the progress of Republic City and the Southern Water Tribes festivals are viewed as occurring in spite of the spirituality on which the nations were founded. As such, light is the spirit of creation, and dark of destruction, with the middle point between the two being stagnation, as we saw before the time of Juan. The Guide. Korra goes to the Southern Air Temple to meet up with Tenzin and his family in order to catch them up on the state of the Civil War, that she was manipulated into opening one spirit portal and that she has to close it again. But as Unalaq's forces are in control of the South, Tenzin suggests that they close the portal by going through the other side, necessitating that she enter the spirit world through meditation. But Tenzin struggles to enter the spirit world as he's never managed to get there before, and thus cannot guide her to it. But Jinora has been communicating with spirits for some time now, and reveals that she knows a way in, following a few spirits to a meditation site. Ultimately, Tenzin still struggles to enter the spirit world, on top of witnessing Korra calm a group of dark spirits, and has to accept that he's not the right guide for Korra, letting Jinora take her instead. Meanwhile, Mako tries to convince Asami that Varrick has been plotting against her for control over weapons manufacturing and shipping, to which Varrick decides that it's time to threaten the guy into compliance. Mako refuses, and the next day the police follow a lead that Mako has been working with the Triad again, planting evidence against him and having him arrested for the theft of Future Industries' warehouse. Unalaq attempts to open the spirit portal from within, bringing his children along to assist but ultimately failing in spite of ignoring his son's injuries. His actions put him in comparison to Tenzin, who has likewise been neglecting some of his responsibilities in his pursuit of spiritual obligations. And yet, while Unalaq is the more accomplished spiritual guide and bender, all of his actions have been performed selfishly, while Tenzin has been struggling to assist Korra in her work. Ultimately, Unalaq is the one to report his failure directly to Vaatu, asking for some sort of forgiveness, while Tenzin's able to recognize his own failures in a field where his daughter has succeeded, and passes the responsibility with grace, even if it takes a while for him to acknowledge his shortcomings. And this thematically fits in with his past actions. Tenzin was the one to suggest that Korra not be exposed to the outside world while she was still in training, alongside her father Tonrak. She resents the authority figures in her life at first, blaming them for her naivety about the way the world works and her lack of hands-on experience. And yet it was this lack of experience that led to the naivety that necessitated the sheltering in the first place. After seeing the same situation play out again with his own daughter, Korra now sees a parallel between her past situation and the current one. She was being protected by people who cared about her, just as Tenzin had hoped to shield Jinora from the dangers of the spirit world. A new spiritual age. While Tenzin is lamenting his inability to guide the Avatar or protect his daughter, Jinora and Korra enter the spirit world together. But a series of strange occurrences separate them. Korra reverts to a childlike state of herself. She eventually gets scared by a phoenix-like spirit and attacks it, only to apologize when she finds out it was a hatchling and carries it until being discovered by Iroh. Iroh teaches her about the way the spirit world works. Human emotions, especially the Avatars, are capable of manipulating the reality around them. When Korra asks Iroh for advice on finding her friend, he suggests that she help the phoenix back to its nest, using what he taught her along the way. Korra ends up returning the bird, which transforms into an adult alongside herself before the two fly to the spirit tree where Vaatu was imprisoned. Meanwhile, Jinora has gone to Wan Chi-tong's library from the first show, studying to find out about the Harmonic Convergence. But Unalaq discovers that she's there and he forcibly takes her to the spirit tree, meeting up with Korra and threatening her to open the northern portal in exchange for Jinora's life. She agrees, but Unalaq betrays his word, attacking the Avatar with the bending he was able to keep before Korra is rescued by the Phoenix from before. In the end, she leaves the spirit world without Jinora, as she's still trapped inside. Uncle Iroh makes his return to the franchise in this episode, his cameo appearance being something with the potential to feel like forced fan service, but coming across instead as an intentional design decision to match the impact of the scene that he's in. Korra enters the spirit world and is immediately made lost by the strangeness of this world. So of course it would have to be somebody familiar to guide her back to a more positive outlook on the location, and having a fan-favorite return for such a role best matches not only the in-universe feeling, but what fans outside the setting are looking for in comfort. His lesson is also about the way that human emotions affect the environment that surrounds us, best seen right after Korra and Jinora are separated. The two characters are close by, but Korra is in a dark wood while Jinora is placed into an open field. Korra is wary of strangeness at first, and immediately encounters a field of spirits who are equally wary of strangers like her. It's not until assuming the best about the spirits around her that the best in them starts to come out, but ultimately Unalaq's dark emotions and Vatu's desire for revenge outweigh her determination, driving Korra out of the spirit world without the one who guided her in there. Night of 1,000 Stars. Bolin's Mover premiere is occurring, and he visits Mako imprisoned once more before the date. There, Mako warns him of Varrick's plot, though Bolin is hesitant to believe him. However, on the day of the premiere, as a crowd is gathered in the arena, hired goons attack the police and capture the president, with Bolin's suspicions enabling him to rush back to aid the president and prevent the kidnapping, with Varrick being arrested after the plot is foiled. He becomes a city hero, and tries to use this influence to convince the Republic forces to join the battle, but in spite of Korra returning and warning him of the danger too, he still decides to keep his troops back in case of a cataclysmic event. However, the imprisoned Varrick attempts to buy some goodwill back by offering a brand new battleship to Team Avatar, including the now vindicated Mako, so that they can take the fight to Unalaq themselves. Back at the South Pole, Tonrak attempts to lead an attack on his brother without Korra's aid, though the attack turns bad when Unalaq begins receiving assistance from dark spirits and is able to eventually subdue his brother, telling him he's going after Korra next. This episode highlights something touched upon in Season 1, and that's the brotherly relationship between Bolin and Mako. Despite Mako thinking that his brother's story is far-fetched, he still trusts his family enough to look into it and to be suspicious of an attack on the president, never losing faith in the fact that his sibling may have actually been onto something, despite the lack of tangible evidence to show him. And once Mako is out of jail, the two brothers immediately make up, knowing that no temporary misunderstanding is enough to shatter their faith in one another in the long term. And then this is put into direct comparison to the fight between Unalaq and Tonrak, two siblings who have been feuding for decades. Neither one truly has an interest in hearing the other brother out, Tonrak skeptical of his brother's intentions from the beginning, and despite these suspicions being valid, his reasoning had less to do with knowledge of the spirit world and far more of a distrust for the guy. Unalaq likewise is shown to have a deep-seated resentment for his older brother, conspiring to have him dethroned and then making the fight over the spirit portals into a personal one. Having these two sibling relationships compared during the episode makes the weaknesses and strengths of each pair stand out, Mako and Bolin's resolve versus the conflicting natures of Korra's family. Harmonic Convergence. Unalaq reveals to his twins what his ultimate plan is, to fuse with Vatu during Harmonic Convergence in order to crown himself as the Dark Avatar. Korra and her friends plot an assault on the South Pole in order to close the spirit portals before the moment of Harmonic Convergence, ultimately siding with Bumi when he comes up with a plan to assault the fortress surrounding the spirit forest from above. They use a biplane aboard the ship, as well as their flying bison Oogie to assault the fortress, but the number of dark spirits surrounding the portal is too high, and they're eventually grounded and captured, all but Bumi, who uses his flute to win over a dark spirit before plotting to infiltrate the fortress and convert the rest. This doesn't work though, and the raging dark spirits force him into a mech, which is controlled by them into a rampage, destroying much of the fortress. Bumi ultimately manages to free the rest of Team Avatar, and they're able to go along with their original plan to enter the spirit portal. But their efforts are too slow as Unalaq is able to overpower them long enough that Harmonic Convergence occurs, shrouding the world in darkness and liberating Vatu from where he was being held. While the previous episode focused on some of the side characters getting to where they needed to be, this one has the main cast reunite and set up the finale of the season, putting people into place for their last role until Book 3. We get some justification for why certain characters are there. The non-bender and now retired Bumi has a moment in the spotlight where he's able to prove that some of his old war stories weren't the exaggerations many assumed them to be. and the first hints of Desna and Eska doubting their father's plan also begin to take shape here, as the other cast members question why their loyalty is still there. Because the main cast is not only fighting to save the world, a motivation that's outwardly compelling but ultimately a bluff by the writers, they're all fighting for people who are close to them. Tenzin is rash in his decision-making, wanting to assault the South Pole head-on in order to rescue his daughter's spirit, and Mako and Bolin have headed out to keep their friend safe, while Korra is hoping to undo her earlier failures as the Avatar, not only in her current life, but dating back to Wan's deception by Vaatu 10,000 years ago. Darkness Falls. Tenzin, Kaya, and Bumi head into the spirit world in order to search for Jinora, but they have no leads and wander aimlessly for a while. Eventually, Iroh appears and warns them about their journey, that if they wander too far, they'll end up in a place for lost souls. Tenzin takes this to heart, intentionally getting captured by a spirit to end up in the fog of lost souls, for humans who have wandered in and gotten trapped. The spirit tests the resolve of each of its inhabitants, sending them to their darkest moments and causing the siblings to become separated, until Aang's spirit guides Tenzin to a revelation to not try to mimic his father, and he's able to dispel the fog for long enough to find everyone again. Korra sends Unalaq out of the spirit world, and Bolin teams up with Mako to prevent him from re-entering, though Desna and Eska team up to stop the brothers, and Unalaq is able to return, just in time to stop Korra from resealing Vaatu, then merging with him. Now the Dark Avatar, Unalaq is able to exorcise Rava from Korra, then destroys the past avatars from their connection to Korra, ending the avatar cycle for good. The Fog of Lost Souls is shown to have trapped a hyperfixated Admiral Zhao, a character from the first season of the original Avatar, who is now in the spirit world still intent on capturing Aang. This is considered the moment of his greatest failing, that his career in the Fire Nation's military has come to an end with one great failure, and the rest of the main cast trapped in there is also shown to have their worst moments on display. Bumi is fearful of an attack where he's surrounded, while Kaya attempts to run away from her problems in life, reflecting the several years alluded to where she refused to settle down until Katara became sick. The end of the first season saw Korra finally create a spiritual connection with the past lives of the Avatar, able to get her bending back from them as her bending talents had always been an extension of their powers. One cannot easily de-bend 10,000 years of training. But by the end of this episode, the past 10,000 years have been undone by an equal power, Vaatu finally defeating Rava and returning the world to the way it had been all that time ago, then following up on that as there's no longer an other half to his power. As spirit bending has always been Korra's weakest area, this serves as a final test for the abilities she's only just received. Light in the Dark. After fusing with Vaatu, Unalaq heads to Republic City to start destroying things there. Korra, Mako, and Bolin are healed by Kaya and brought to the Spirit Tree, where Korra laments that she's lost her ability to connect with the past avatars and can no longer fight Unalaq. But Tenzin encourages her to attempt to connect with the spirits anyway, where she's able to make a small connection with her own spirituality, enabling her to project herself to Republic City so she can fight off Unalaq. During the fight, she attempts to free the captured Rava, but struggles to find him, until a projection of Jinora guides her to find the light spirit once more, still residing inside of the dark. The two refuse, and Korra is able to mantle the role of Avatar once again, allowing her to defeat Vaatu once and for all. Before the Harmonic Convergence ends, she decides that Unalaq was right to try to connect the spirit world and the physical one, no longer letting herself serve as the sole bridge between the two. Bolin and Eska break up, and Korra remembers her breakup with Mako, while the North and South Water Tribes remain permanently independent moving forward. The previous episode saw Tenzin struggling as he felt he was not a good enough spiritual guide for Korra, then learning not to try to live up to the name of his father but to find his own legacy, and finally managing to redeem himself by guiding Korra towards finding her own legacy as well. Considering that Korra started out the series as strong-headed and eager to do things independently, there's a sense of growth from her character in that she no longer wants to do things solo and has come to rely on her spiritual connections to her previous lives, as well as the role she was born into. And just as she begins to accept this role, she loses that connection. Korra loses the connection to the previous avatars just as she's grown to accept and rely on them, so an independent character is now forced back into the habits that she grew out of. But it's not to say that this is a total loss, as shortly after the connection was severed, she was able to learn a lesson about making her own way in life and not simply continuing cycles. Ironically, a lesson taught to her by Tenzin, who was taught it by Aang, making that the final bit of wisdom passed from one avatar to the next. Book 3. Change. Book 1 aired with a lot of promotion for new episodes and placed into a good time slot, Saturday, to maximize viewership. It was the follow-up series for one of their most popular franchises with critics, but was still far from the darling of the network. Season 2 was moved to the Friday night slot instead, where TV shows go to die, as it's not a very lucrative place to be, and this was all made worse by the show moving around a bit on its air date, making it even harder for fans to see each new episode. Then, before Book 3 was set to air, a series of episodes were leaked online in a security breach that led to the season being aired rather abruptly with very little advertising. This led to even worse performance with broad demographics, and ultimately The Legend of Korra was pushed into an online-only release structure with very little promotion at all. In spite of this lack of attention from the network itself, however, The Legend of Korra was still extremely popular with its intended demographic. It merely struggles to reach audiences outside that niche. But for those who found themselves in the right place at the right time, The Legend of Korra was able to maintain not only the interest short-term, but long-term as well. Much of the promotion for this show was done by word of mouth among enthusiastic cartoon fans, the kind who would not be perturbed by a Friday night time slot. And just as its predecessor has maintained a stronger fan base today than it did during its original airing. A breath of fresh air. Bumi is chasing after Boomju when he falls from a cliff, stopping his fall with a sudden burst of airbending. Despite his family not believing him at first, he's later able to prove his claim around the same time that Mako is investigating claims of another airbender, a man named Daw who accidentally wrecked his store and is fearful of hurting anybody else. Meanwhile, Korra is gaining the ire of Republic City as they resent her for opening the spirit portals, due to this leaving several spirit vines across the city, blocking roads and trapping homes, while Korra herself is powerless to do anything to stop them. After hanging out with the Sami and bonding with her a bit, she learns about Daw from earlier, that he's climbed to the top of a bridge and refuses to come down. She flies up to him and shares some wisdom that Tenzin gave her about accepting change, the guy ultimately agreeing to come down with her so he can adjust to his new lifestyle. Meanwhile, a White Lotus prisoner named Zahir is being fed by his guards when he shows off his newly acquired airbending that he uses to escape, then heading out to reform the Red Lotus and destroy the Avatar. Change in this sense is shown to come about in two ways. The first is change that we actively seek out. For example, Korra opening the spirit portals so that the two worlds can remain linked. The other is change that happens without our approval, such as the vines that appear across Republic City. And between these two types of change are changes that we actively welcome, like Bumi finally being able to airbend just as his father wanted him to do, and Daw, who doesn't want to be an airbender and had the new life thrust upon him. But no matter whether the change is something you sought out or caused yourself, the response to this change always has to be the same. You adapt. Korra is no longer able to connect with her past lives and is forced to go on without their wisdom, but she has no choice on what to do in this situation. She's still the Avatar, and still has responsibilities that necessitate that she find guidance elsewhere. Likewise, some of these changes can seem positive while still requiring adaptation. Bumi can airbend now, but as we saw with Daw, this can be something dangerous that requires practice and tempering to even so much as return to your own life. And even then, there's no such thing as going back to the way things used to be, as the world itself is always moving on. Rebirth. Korra and Tenzin set out to find more airbenders from across the world, convincing Mako to put up his awkwardness about traveling with them behind. But Tenzin's pitches to the newfound airbenders don't go over well, as very few people are willing to leave their own lives behind to adopt the detached ways of air nomads. Eventually, they settle on a new method of putting on airbending performances to attract the next generation of bender, and they attract the attention of a young thief named Kai, who swears he's renouncing his thieving ways, despite still trying to pull a fast one on Team Avatar. Meanwhile, the escaped Zahir travels to a series of tailor-made prisons for Gazan, an earthbender who can create lava, and Minghua, a waterbender who uses water for arms. After the three are freed, they make their way to free the last Bender from imprisonment, while an aged Zuko, riding on Dragonback, sets out to stop them. Tenzin is one of the most eager to accept the change of the new Airbenders revealed across the world, and yet in spite of this eagerness to accept change, he's still not fully ready for it, as he begins requesting that people leave their old lives behind so that they can live exactly the way that his cultural ancestors did so many decades ago. In this instance, he's assuming that the change that will occur is a change to bring things back to how they used to be, not accepting that these old ways are gone for good after 170 years of not being practiced. This ties into Korra's detachment from her past lives as the Avatar, that as much as she wants to go back to view the wisdom of those who came before, she can't, and that doing so is likely not the best option in the first place. So many of today's problems are unique to the current era. To try to find wisdom from people who don't relate to what you're going through won't give very good advice. Even in the original series, Aang sought out advice from his previous incarnations, only to reject it in favor of energy bending. And Tenzin too has to accept that the way the Air Nomads will rebuild is going to be different from their past lives and culture, putting on a show to attract people with flashy lights, instead of the more solemn and dignified lifestyle he's been living alone for his whole life. The Earth Queen. Team Avatar arrives in the Earth capital of Ba Sing Se, where they prepare to follow up on the Republic City reports of Airbenders appearing through the city. But shortly after they land, Kai goes missing as he's been running a pickpocketing scam using his airbending powers, and while pursuing him, Mako and Bolin get swindled onto a tram to the city's impoverished lower ring. They sleep on the streets for a while before getting into an argument with a fruit merchant who happens to be a cousin of theirs, and the two are invited to a family home where they catch up with long estranged relatives. Meanwhile, Korra is introduced to the Earth Queen, a strict monarch with many arbitrary rules, who refuses to help Korra locate the Airbenders until she does a favor for her, transporting a cache of tax money back to the capital safely, as the last few shipments have all been attacked. The gangsters who tried to steal the money are driven off, but not before warning Korra that she's on the wrong side of the fight, and after returning to the Earth Queen, she tells off the Avatar, stating that there are no Airbenders in Ba Sing Se. Back at their family's house, Bolin and Mako hear rumors about Airbenders disappearing as Dai Li agents kidnap them, something that ends up happening to Kai as the episode ends. Mako and Bolin both grew up impoverished and without a close relationship to their parents due to the latter's death. Despite this, they worked their way up, even if through illegitimate means, and managed to become something greater than where they came from, much to the excitement of their family who received no word about them in the intermittent time. This story is compared to the life of Kai, who grew up orphaned as well, and is implied to have drifted into the criminal lifestyle as a result. And yet Mako and Bolin both have a different interpretation of the boy, despite the similarities. Mako, the older brother, is mistrustful of the kid. He himself was far more involved with the life of crime, and sees more of himself in Kai's current lifestyle. He always tried to shield his younger brother from the worst parts of that life, and as a result, his treatment of Kai mirrors this desire, not to see someone grow up to be like him. Bolin, on the other hand, was left in the dark about the things his older brother went through for the family's sake, and is more eager to relate to Kai on his past rather than his present, because he knows that things have a chance of turning out alright in the end. In Harm's Way. Mako and Bolin are able to get passports allowing them back into the inner ring of Ba Sing Se, where they can warn Asami and Korra about the Earth Queen's capture of the Airbenders in her city. After having Jinora astral project her way underneath Lake Laogai to no success, Korra suggested they try to locate Kai specifically, finding him in the catacombs beneath the Earth Temple nearby, where he and the other Airbenders have been undergoing brutal underground training to make them into soldiers for the Queen. Around this time, Lin arrives in Ba Sing Se to warn Korra that members of the Red Lotus have escaped, a group that had tried to kidnap her as a child, and that Korra has to go into hiding. But she refuses to run away and is set on freeing the Airbenders, creating a plan to sneak in and liberate them all. But the Dai Li are hot on their trail as they attempt to escape the catacombs and the city, with an effort by the liberated and now experienced Airbenders to prevent them from capturing the group. In the end, Tenzin gives the new Airbenders the opportunity to go with him or to go into hiding, and they choose freedom and Tenzin's guidance. A few episodes ago, Tenzin's attempts to recruit new Airbenders were rebuked, as very few people were eager to make that change in their lives, an implication that the only ones who would choose to be air nomads were the ones who were born into that lifestyle, that those with other earthly attachments would refuse to give up on things like family and property. But sometimes change is a thing that happens at us instead of to us, and we don't get the option not to choose a side. After the Earth Queen conscripts Airbenders into her army and they're broken out of the imprisonment, they're put into a state where they have to choose between hiding or training. They cannot simply go back to their old lives now that they're fugitives. When put into these less amicable terms, the choice that so many rejected earlier is now the best option. Outside of that, this episode gives the audience so many little payoffs to earlier moments that show the strengths and benefits of The Legend of Korra becoming a much more continuously episodic show, and having a slower start to the season. Things like the Earth Queen's dislike of animals being a result of severe allergies that result in her banning all creatures from the castle grounds, or the slight callbacks to the last Airbenders episodes that take place in the same city, including Team Avatar staying at the very same location as the last series. And of course, a character like Kai is able to slowly grow out of his old habits as the daily training he was forced to undergo causes him to feel a bit more sympathetic to people he earlier would have viewed as easy marks. The Metal Clan. Team Avatar follows their next lead on a new airbender in Zaofu, a city dedicated to metal-bending arts run by the matriarch Su Yin. Su Yin is the daughter of Toph and the half-sister of Lin, who was showing some hesitation at entering the city in the first place as she doesn't get along with the rest of her family. Speaking of that family, the youngest daughter, Opal, is the new airbender Korra has been searching for. But as Su Yin is hesitant to allow Opal to leave the city, Korra volunteers to train the new airbender on the basics before they leave. While staying the night, Opal and Bolin begin to flirt for a while, and Varric returns, claiming he's not technically a criminal as he was freed by the spirits before his trial. This is something that Su Yin welcomes, as she prides herself on reforming criminals. Korra attempts to get Lin to spend more time with her family, but Lin rebukes this request, causing the two to argue as Korra says the police chief will stay bitter and alone. Meanwhile, on Air Temple Island, Zahir adopts a fake name in order to infiltrate the Airbenders' training, although his enthusiasm for their culture later outs his real identity, after Kaya notices it suspiciously. Su Yin and Lin are both the children of Toph from The Last Airbender, a woman whose childhood and upbringing were exceedingly strict as she was made to stay inside and trained to be the ideal image of what her parents wanted her to be. As such, she tried the opposite approach when raising her own children, giving them utter freedom and independence as she largely left them to raise themselves. This resulted in the two constantly seeking out some sort of guidance in spite of all of this, conflating their mother's lack of rules and regulation as a lack of attention. Most of Team Avatar from the original show wound up as lacking parents, and this makes sense due to a general trend in how they themselves were raised. Aang is shown to have given special treatment to Tenzin growing up, in exception to his other children, as Aang himself was raised by the group style of the air nomads, never knowing his own parents, and thus never having an example to make out of them. Toph grew up in similarly poor conditions, though for the opposite reason, and likewise struggled with her own children's upbringing. Old wounds. Noticing how upset Lin is, she's recommended to go to an acupuncturist who can ease her mind. While there, she starts to relive old memories of her teenage years, alongside her sister, who had fallen in with a bad crowd and worked as a getaway driver for a gang. When Lin was patrolling one day, she began to arrest Su Yin when their ensuing fight caused the scar on Lin's cheek. Not wanting her reputation damaged, Toph covered up the incident and sent Su Yin away. Meanwhile, Su Yin is teaching Korra how to metal bend, and the Avatar is quick to learn the basics, much to the annoyance of Bolin, who has tried and failed to learn metal bending in the past. But when the duo catch him listening in on one of their lessons, Su Yin offers to teach him, only for an enraged Lin to attack her sister for ruining their mother's career. But Opal steps in to stop the fight, and after sleeping off her feelings, Lin finally convinces her niece to go to the Northern Air Temple to train in spite of what her mother wants her to do. While this is happening, Zahir and the rest of the Red Lotus escape the security of Republic City and plot to track down Korra. As their paths in life diverged, Lin and Su Yin both adopted not only different traits, but differing philosophies around these traits. Su-yin never took any responsibility for her actions growing up, and as a result often failed to see any harm that came to other people from her actions. Even in the present, she still doesn't seem to understand why Lin would have some reservations about visiting her old family, or why they didn't get along with one another. But Lin herself also stays in many of her old methods of thinking for far longer than it makes sense to. She was justified in wanting her sister to face some sort of consequence for her actions growing up, but also failed to consider that, after so many years have passed, her sister is capable of changing. Lin attributes her mother's retirement to her sister's actions in disgracing the family, something Su-yin and Toph have already worked out among each other. And she continues to hold a grudge about this in the present day, not letting go of this even after Su-yin has learned from her past and moved on alongside all the others who have also accepted the new her. Original Airbenders. Tenzin is teaching the new Airbenders the ways of his people and culture, though he struggles to really get through to any of the new recruits. Korra suggests that he get some leadership advice from Bumi, a former admiral, and Bumi recommends harsher lessons. But these lessons fail as well, and Bumi grows sick of being pushed around, quitting his role as a member of the Air Nation and taking many of the others with him. While this is happening, Jinora and Kai are visiting a group of newly born sky bison when Kai suggests that Jinora ask for her airbending master tattoos. But Tenzin refuses this request and she storms off with Kai, where the two are captured by poachers alongside parts of the herd. Jinora sends a distress signal in spirit form to Boomju, and Bumi calls the rest of the airbending recruits into action to rescue them. They make a plan to storm the camp where the poachers have set up, and using the lessons they've been taught up to that point, manage to free Jinora and capture the poachers. In the end, Tenzin is proud of the new recruits who appreciate the more practical experience and decides to look into letting Jinora get her master tattoos. Tenzin is hesitant to let Jinora get the markings of an airbending master at first, less because he's concerned that she's not really ready yet, and more out of a belief that she's still far too young for such things. This is his protective streak kicking in, something we've seen out of Tenzin thus far in his treatment of Korra in the first 2 seasons, although this was in part due to the Red Lotus's attempts to kidnap her, and is coming back around in his treatment of the new air nomads. He wants as much as anything for the people he takes into his protection to wind up as similar to himself as possible. With Korra, he regrets not teaching her as much in the ways of spirituality as he wishes he had, partially justified as that was always his weakest skill. And yet, it wasn't until Korra left his tutelage that she was truly able to come into her own as the Avatar. That independence is what gave her the necessary skill set. So once again, between the Air Acolytes and his daughter, Tenzin is trying to protect those closest to him while accidentally stifling their growth by keeping them too close. It's only letting go of the ideas that he has for other people and letting them behave more freely that will finally enable them to come into their own, much as Tenzin himself learned last season in the Fog of Lost Souls. The Terror Within. After a few days of metal bending practice, Korra and the others are resting up and saying their goodbyes to Opal. But in the middle of the night, Zahir and the Red Lotus are able to infiltrate the city, where they break into Korra's room and kidnap her. Pabu is able to detect them and wakes up the others in time to confront the group in the middle of a courtyard, where the Red Lotus are able to hold off Zaofu's guards. But with a bit of help from Bolin's precise earthbending and an attack from above by Lin and Su-yin working together, they're able to rescue Korra, with the others all fleeing. After she recovers, the city guard works with Aiwei, a truth teller, to determine who among the guards sold out the city, eventually pinning the blame on a young guard. But Varric is still suspicious and has them search Aiwei's house, finding a secret tunnel that Aiwei then rigs to explode when he learns of their suspicions. Lin wants to take Korra back to Republic City for her protection, but Su-yin lies and gives them some cover to flee and chase down the Red Lotus on their own. This is the episode that shifts the third book from a slightly more episodic tone with lower stakes into the faster pace the series had had thus far. While Avatar has always been a story to focus more on overarching plots than standalone tales, the series is finding a bit of strength from having smaller, self-contained stories about individual characters, such as the way the previous episode focused solely on the Airbenders, and then this one follows up on a conclusion to the Beifong family's drama. This allows the pacing to flow in a much easier to follow means. While it might be slightly less realistic for smaller stories to stay standalone like this instead of every plot mixing together at once, it makes these stories paced better on an individual scale, leading to the cast feeling stronger as we follow one group at a time. By the midpoint of this episode, Zahir has finally launched his attack on Korra, but is driven off by the combined efforts of several strong groups, the attack only being possible in the first place due to a lapse in security and trust by someone close to them. It's a nice step up from the previous seasons, where the antagonists felt overbearingly powerful with some kind of a unique ability only they had. Unalaq's dark spirits were able to overwhelm Korra whenever the plot demanded, while Zahir has to get the drop on the group to succeed. This means that attacks can come whenever the audience and characters least suspect it, adding to the overall sense of tension as you assume the next time you drop your guard is when you'll be hit. The Stakeout. Team Avatar tracks Zahir to the Misty Palms Oasis, though it's difficult for them to run their investigation as they're all wanted criminals within the Earth Kingdom due to the decree of the Earth Queen. They track the Red Lotus further, eventually coming across their getaway vehicle, where they split up, with Korra and Asami finding the meeting place between Zahir and Aiwei, while Bolin and Mako find Aiwei himself. After a stakeout, they learn that the meeting place is actually inside the spirit world, so Korra meditates to track them down, while the rest stay behind to guard her physical body. But Zahir, after throwing Aiwei into the fog of lost souls, decides to sit down and discuss his plans with Korra, teaching her about the Red Lotus and how the organization split off from the White Lotus. Their plan is to eliminate governments to create a new world order, and they had hoped that they could teach Korra their ideals from a young age, so that she might assist them. But while this conversation is happening, he has the Red Lotus assault their position, with Mako and Bolin being captured in the process, while a fleeing Asami is eventually stopped and captured by the Earth Queen's forces. This episode starts to explain some of the earlier aspects of the show, such as including Unalaq as a member of the Red Lotus, and explaining that their earlier attempts to kidnap Korra were done for a more ideological reason than a sheer lust for her powers. This helps the faction more thoroughly integrate into the show's existing setting, while also making their actions seem a bit more understandable. Zahir believes that his goals align with Korra's to a certain extent. She left the spirit portals open, just as he had wanted to, while also separating his actions from the more megalomaniacal actions that concluded the previous season. This also ties into Korra's lack of spirituality and the poor understanding of the responsibilities of the Avatar from the beginning of the show, as well as making these failings into a much more concerning aspect of her character, as it means her convictions are also lacking alongside them. The White Lotus and the Red Lotus have differing goals, but they both ultimately want to work through the Avatar, so having Korra be more of a philosophical blank slate makes the intentions of Zahir more powerful, as Korra is more open to being able to stand for what they want her to stand for. If you don't have strong beliefs, you're more susceptible to being influenced. Long live the Queen. The Red Lotus transport Mako and Bolin to the Earth Queen and offer to tell her where the Airbenders are being held, in exchange for Korra. But after waiting around, they discover that the Earth Queen has lost the Avatar, so they execute the next part of their plan and assassinate the Regent by bending the air out of her lungs. After this, they broadcast a message to Ba Sing Se, that the Queen is dead, and there are no more tyrants to rule them over. They tear down the lower walls, plunging the city into chaos. After the city's power balance has shifted, Mako and Bolin are cornered by Zahir, who asks them to send a message to Korra. Meanwhile, Korra and Asami are being transported to Ba Sing Se to be brought before the Earth Queen, but Asami is able to break out of the cell and free Korra. The two then break into the control room, where they take down the blimp while trying to take out the captain. After being stranded in the desert, they're able to construct a sand sailor to escape back to the nearest village, where Korra meets up with Tonrak, Lin, and Zuko, while discovering the news about the Earth Queen. The Red Lotus executes its plan in this episode by having the monarchs that rule over the various people executed, then having the people govern themselves, something shown here to result in rioting and looting. And while these are often common after any poorly planned transition of power, it also speaks to the larger philosophy of the episode's villain. Zahir considers chaos as the ultimate form of freedom, that if people are free from any rules whatsoever, they can finally be freed themselves. In spite of the Earth Queen being shown to be a tyrant, as well as the Republic's president shown as ineffective in politicking, the alternative hardly shows itself to be any better, although this draws a comparison to Korra herself. The Avatar is meant to be a leader, someone who is looked up to in spirit if not legally, and so far the series has stressed the many failures that Korra has made leading up to this point. She's kept the spirit portals open, and this has caused vines to encroach the city itself, displacing people from their homes as they view the cohabitating spirits as pests. And while many people have pointed out that this is a failure of Korra in her role, others have also said that this is still a subjective failure. The spirits themselves are getting along fine, and the people who have received airbending powers are able to lead rich, new lives. So too are the ineffective leaders of other various areas shown to do something, even if very little, to improve the lives and safety of the people who live underneath them. The Ultimatum. After escaping the chaos in Ba Sing Se, Bolin and Mako commandeer an airship to get their family out of the fires and to track down Korra. They're able to find the ruins of the airship from last episode and trace the tracks of the glider back to the Misty Palms Oasis where the group reunites. There, they give Korra Zahir's message. He is threatening to wipe out the Northern Air Temple if Korra doesn't surrender herself to them. Korra heads back to Zaofu with the hopes of finding a stronger radio that can pass this warning on to Tenzin so he can evacuate the new Air Nation, but they're too late in sending the signal. Unsure what to do, Korra meditates to try to find Zahir in the spirit world, only to find Iroh instead, who gives her the idea to ask Zuko for advice as Aang is no longer spiritually connected to her. Back at the Air Temple, the Red Lotus has arrived and surrounded the temple with an airship, but Tenzin refuses to stay put and starts to fight off the Red Lotus to buy time for his family and students to escape. But when police scares off the bison and the few fighting members of the group are overwhelmed, the episode ends on a bad note. Leading up to the finale of the season, the cast begins physically going backwards through everything that's happened thus far and where it happened. Bolin and Mako travel from the capital of the Earth Kingdom through to the Oasis, where they were before, then back to the Metalbenders before ending the season in a showdown surrounding the newly formed airbending nomads. As such, we're able to see introductions done from the opposite perspective. The animosity that Suyin and Lin felt towards one another is now a distant memory in the coordination they have, even working together next episode flawlessly. And the promise of returning to the rest of the Air Nomads by the season's end lets us know that this finale will also test the formation of this new nation in its first true challenge. There's also a hint at how Korra will function moving forwards after losing the connections to the past avatars in Season 2. While she may not be able to directly communicate with the previous incarnations of herself through the spirit world, she can still interact with their lives through the physical world, gaining wisdom by studying their actions and the effects these actions have had on society. This is ironically the same way Zahir has been able to build up his skills as an airbender, not through direct communication with the airbenders of history, but by studying their written works and the culture surrounding them. Enter the Void. Korra agrees to give herself up to Zahir in exchange for the safety of the Air Nomads, with the rest of her backup splitting into two groups to plan around freeing her afterwards. Korra goes with Zahir, becoming shackled to limit her bending, while Tonrak and the Metalbenders scale the mountain for an ambush. Bolin, Asami, and Mako go to the Air Temple with the airship to escort the Airbenders to safety, but once Korra's incapacitated, the plan is revealed, that the Airbenders have been removed, and Ghazan lava bends the temple into destruction. They're barely able to escape due to Bolin discovering his ability to lava bend before meeting up with the others. Meanwhile, the Metalbenders fight against Pali, with Sulin and Lin coordinating to contain one of her explosions, resulting in a backfire and leaving Zahir alone. With the only person he loves being eliminated, he detaches himself from the Earth literally, flying away with Korra in captivity. He takes her to a cave where a poison is prepared as the rest of the cast prepares to make one last attack. We've seen characters develop skills rapidly while in danger many times up to this point thus far, and this is far from something that happens purely in the interest of dramatic tension. Characters who have had simple and easy lives are rarely as effective at bending than those who have worked harder and struggled to get what they have. It's through some sort of conviction that people are able to achieve their best selves, whether it's a harsh circumstance in their past or an intentional decision to seek out difficulty and push through it in training. As such, there's a hint that all great things have to come from some sort of sacrifice, giving up a part of what you're attached to in order to achieve a greater end goal. By losing her connection to the past avatars, Korra has been able to grow independently of them, making the strength she's gained in the last season entirely her own. Likewise, Zahir losing his connection to the world by losing someone he loves is also shown to unlock a great power within himself. But with all of these sacrifices, there's always going to be the question of whether this effort is worth the end result. Many people would likely choose their loved ones over some additional power, just as Bolin doesn't learn about his lava bending powers until he turns around to sacrifice himself in order to hold off the impending fiery graves of his friends. Venom of the Red Lotus. The Red Lotus prepares to inject mercury into Korra's veins, the poison triggering the Avatar state so they can end the cycle forever. Despite trying to resist it, the Avatar state eventually activates, yet because of this, she becomes much more powerful and Korra is able to break free just as backup arrives to start fighting alongside her. Mako is able to dispatch Minghua by luring her into a pool and electrocuting her arms. Bolin and Mako then fight Kazan, who implodes the mountain around him instead of being taken alive. Meanwhile, Korra fights Zahir directly, using fire to fly around, but as the fight drags on she becomes weakened by the poison. Before Zahir is able to finish her off, a combined effort by the rest of the Airbenders is able to drag him down to the ground, where he's captured and Korra is able to have the poison bent out of her by Suyin. The episode ends with Jinora being welcomed as a master of airbending, finally having earned her tattoos while the rest of the Airbenders attend the ceremony. They vow to continue defending the world in the Avatar's place, as Korra is now bound to a wheelchair. Zahir's plan has ultimately been to rid the world of any and all potential leadership, from the Earth Queen to the Avatar herself. He believes that people are only truly free when they can't be bound by rules and restrictions, but this is an ideology that ultimately gives way to chaos instead of true order. When there are no laws preventing it, the strong ultimately wind up overpowering the weak and ruling through might, much in the same way that we saw Wan, pre-Avatar, living in squalor during the flashback to Season 2. In fact, these regulations often end up being the thing that allows people to live the most freely, as people can grow and train without constantly looking over their shoulder or serving a tyrant who rules through might. So it's fitting that Zahir is the antagonist who is brought down by pure physical strength. Korra defeated Amon by exposing his hypocrisy in front of his followers, where he was then taken down by his own brother. Unalaq was merely sealed away by a powered-up light spirit, with Korra serving as a conduit. But Zahir was beaten down with might, the major flaw in his ideology expressed in the form of a tornado, bringing him back down to face consequences. It's also fitting that this cyclone was made by the Air Nomads, who had only recently accepted the new rules and lifestyle brought upon them, a group of individuals voluntarily accepting new rules and leadership for the betterment of their own society and themselves. Book 4. Balance. It's almost fitting that The Legend of Korra's final season was aired exclusively online, Nickelodeon dropping the remainder of the episodes they ordered onto a website with little fanfare and promptly forgetting about the whole thing. Considering that it's online that spread so much of the show's popularity, and that's where most of the continued discussion and support remains, that the show should be doomed to the medium where its most avid fans will already be, feels like a last good deed done for the show, albeit one completely unintentional. There's a variety of theories as to why the show was abandoned in this way despite the positive reception it was getting. Everything from the darker subject matter potentially disturbing some of the younger viewers, to the imagery invoking ideas that the network did not want airing on their airwaves, though ultimately it might just come down to image. The Legend of Korra as a show was maturing alongside its audience while airing on a network that tried to appeal to children, and no matter what the show actually ends up saying or doing with its 22 minutes, it's still difficult to convince a serious audience to take a cartoon on the level it intends to be taken at. Book 4 felt as though it was being pushed out the door out of a sense of obligation, but only by the network. The creators, voice cast, and really anyone on board with the project still showed the level of passion for their work that they've had since the beginning, a passion that only burnt brighter by the wind trying to snuff it out. And so The Legend of Korra attempts to go out not with the intended whimper, but a bang. After all these years. 3 years after the previous season ended, Asami is getting future industries back on track with the monorail line connecting Republic City to Ba Sing Se, where the future Earth King, the vapid Prince Wu, is soon to be crowned. His bodyguard, Mako, is excited to finally be able to go back to life in Republic City after the ceremony, but learns from Lin that he's been specifically requested to stay by the future king's side, as he's been very effective at keeping the dissidents away from disgracing him. These dissidents largely support Kuvira, a metalbender from Zaofu, who has been reunited the anarchic Earth Kingdom bit by bit through her ability to dismantle the roving gangs of bandits who have effectively taken over. This is much to the chagrin of Opal and Kai, who have been trying to keep the individual kingdoms independent but are struggling to work effectively with their numbers so spread thin. A more personal conflict as Bolin has signed up with Kuvira and is working directly under her, with Kuvira also engaged to Batar Jr., Suyin's eldest son. At the end of the episode, when the new Team Avatar is excited about their reunion, it's revealed that Korra has been lying about her location for the past 6 months, spending her free time fighting in underground earthbending arenas. Book 4 begins with the premise of a world without an avatar, one where Korra's missing in action following a series of world-changing events. With nobody available to guide society back on track, that role that was usually faced by the spiritual leader, people have had to take matters into their own hands, for better and for worse. The Earth Kingdom is largely still in disarray, and with no avatar to repair things to the way they used to be, people look elsewhere, finding solace in Kuvira, who's been unifying the territories through force. Not force in the sense that she's conquering territory, but that she's properly laying down the law in absence of anyone else who can do so. As much as the Avatar has been a force for maintaining peace, they have also historically been a force for maintaining the status quo. Many of the old guard in the setting are looking to restore a monarch to the throne of the Earth Kingdom, hoping that stability will follow. But the new guard are focusing on peace at any cost and looking for a new solution, one they find in Kuvira, the Unifier. This, coupled with the newly available technology, such as the rail line connecting various nations, gives the world a modern look that much more closely resembles our real-world society, one that, I shouldn't need to mention, has no avatar, and this too comes for better and for worse. Korra Alone. A flashback of Korra separating from the rest of Team Avatar as she returns to the Southern Water Tribe in order to rehabilitate. It takes some prodding from her parents, but she eventually sees Katara, with the intention of being healed and relearning to walk, a slow process that she almost gives up on, but is eventually able to get the hang of. But despite regaining some of her physical strength, she's still tormented by flashbacks of her fight with Zahir, including aspects of her fight against herself as she struggled to control the Avatar state during that battle. A vision of the Avatar state chases her around as she flees around the world, lying to the rest about where she's been while failing to live up to the expectations of herself and others. This hallucination eventually leads her to the earthbending arena where she was seen last episode, after throwing away her identity, and, after losing a bout, she follows a small dog into the swamps nearby, losing one more fight against herself before awakening in a cave where Toph Beifong is nursing her back to health. Korra's always been a strong-willed person, even since the beginning of the series, and yet this isn't necessarily portrayed in a negative light. Despite the fact that she routinely makes situations worse by not thinking about consequences when rushing in, the fact that her heart is always in the right place makes up for that. We've seen other leaders come across as ineffective due to their insistence on waiting things out, or not quickly responding to the call to action, but Korra's always tried to put other people first, even if she does so in a somewhat egotistic way. As such, she ends up serving as a model avatar, the person people can reliably expect to appear the moment she's needed, with the impression they'll be safe as long as she's around. This then makes her failures to fight properly come across as even worse, as the world is recovering without her, making all that she's ever tried to stand for worthless in this life or any of her past ones. The mental damage she's taken ends up having a negative effect on her ability to recover, making a second block to living up to the responsibilities she's supposed to have, made worse by the fact that these ghosts haunting her can't be detected or understood by the people she's meant to be saving, making that failure look like it's her own. But this isn't the case, as she knows, because of the strong link between bending and the Avatar state. Just because something happened in your mind does not make it any less real. The Coronation. Prince Wu is planning for his upcoming lavish coronation ceremony, but is told that it will be a much smaller event than planned due to most of the things he's requesting having been looted during the chaos of the last 3 years. The coronation ends up with poor attendance, made worse for Wu when Kuvira approaches to stand and announces that she has no plans to cede power back to the monarch, declaring that the age of monarchy is over and that the Earth Kingdom is now the Earth Empire. Mako and Bolin meet up after this announcement, with Bolin siding with Kuvira due to the work she's done on repairing the damage to the Earth Empire, their home, while Mako believes she's just another tyrant seizing power. Back in the swamps, Korra is failing to make headway in her training with Toph, who realizes there's still some mercury inside of Korra's system, blocking her from returning to action, metal that Korra refuses to relinquish as it would force her to face responsibilities again. As the episode ends, Varrick is shown running a series of experiments on some spirit finds from Republic City, which Kuvira claims must now be his top priority. The metal inside of Korra's body is explained as the real reason she's struggling to get back to her old level of strength, something Korra is excited to hear as it finally gives an excuse to the mental block preventing her from growing. But whenever Toph attempts to remove it, Korra struggles. She's internalized the damage as a convenient excuse to avoid her responsibilities, showing that it's much more than just a physical barrier preventing her from action. Since the events of last season, Korra's debilitations are intended to reflect aspects of post-traumatic stress. The mental anguish of her failures and the physical danger are still present in her mind even after that danger is gone. And all of this compounds into her absence. Kuvira is shown to be popular among the Earth Empire citizens due to the fact that she's made actionable change in their lives, cleaning up roving gangs of bandits and forcibly recruiting collapsing states into her rule. People love her because of what she's done for them, and these actions justify her power. The only claim Prince Wu has to power is the fact that he's a prince. He hasn't done anything to justify that position. And over the past 3 years, Korra hasn't done anything either, which eats her up inside. The only claim she has to power is the fact that she's the Avatar, which is meaning less and less the more she stays out of the picture. The Calling. Tenzin tasks his children with tracking down Korra and bringing her back to Republic City to help with Kuvira's takeover. They enter the Earth Kingdom and ask around, but find very few leads, until Milo throws out the food their mother packed, and Ikki storms off to find more, where she ultimately gets captured by Earth Kingdom soldiers who, upon learning who she is, plan to capture the rest of the Airbender children to take to Kuvira. But Ikki manages to convince them to give up some of their plans and is ultimately saved by her siblings, where the trio decides to search for Korra in the only place no one else is looking for her, the swamp. At the swamp, Toph is refusing to train Korra properly, guiding her instead to an area where the trees keep flashing her fight memories back into her mind. Toph reveals that the thing preventing her from growing is the memory of all those conflicts, and asks her to think more critically about them. They do this by meditating at the banyan tree, where her spirit energy connects with Jinora, and the Airbenders are reunited. Toph then guides Korra through bending the metal out of her system, and she's once again able to activate the Avatar state. Throughout the show, we've seen that Korra and others tend to learn the fastest when something's on the line. When stakes are high, people are quick to adapt. When there's very little risk, progress comes about much slower, as it's difficult to tell what you're fighting for. Aimlessly attempting to become stronger is a poor ideology, and the only strength that really matters is strength with some sort of purpose. This is why Toph believes that the antagonists so far have failed in their efforts. They were misguided by some sort of vague ideal, and went about getting what they wanted in the wrong way. It's worth mentioning that every antagonist has, in a way, gotten exactly what they claimed they wanted. Amon wanted equality between benders and non-benders, though his methods were by crippling benders to be dragged down to the level of others. Instead, this equality has come about through empowering non-benders. People like Varrick and Asami are able to find success in the world without power. Unalaq wanted to link the spirit world to the physical one, and Korra ended up maintaining this exactly. But Unalaq also tried to form a dark avatar, and lost when he became obsessed with this power. And Zahir hoped to get rid of law, so that people would be ruled by their own ambitions, and while a few monarchs have been taken care of, Kuvira is able to use his survival of the fittest attitude to consolidate power. Enemy at the Gates. Korra and Kuvira both converge on Zaofu with the intention of settling things there. Kuvira attempting to take her old hometown, while Korra wants to prevent a fight from breaking out. Korra visits Suyin to ask if there's a diplomatic solution, and is told the story of the divide between the two. Suyin refused to take up the mantle of Conqueror by reuniting the Earth Kingdom, so Kuvira left to do it herself. But despite serving as a go-between for the two sides, Korra's unable to prevent a conflict, and both sides prepare for battle. Meanwhile, Varrick is working on his Spirit Vine project only to have pangs of a consciousness that makes him shut the project down. But Kuvira refuses to hear of this and orders him to continue, under threat of a re-education camp, with Zhu Li announcing her loyalty to Kuvira in the process. Bolin, despite being used as a pawn to try to convince Zaofu to surrender peacefully, starts to have his doubts about the whole empire and is ordered into a camp for disobeying Kuvira. Back at Republic City, Asami meets with her father to ask him to stop writing to her, but when Hiroshi apologizes, she starts believing that he deserves a second chance. Kuvira at this point is motivated by creating peace in the Earth Empire no matter the cost of that peace. She's willing to forcibly conscript others to her side and make threats of violence in order to ensure that the countryside is safe and secure. But Suyin sees this as chaos under a different name, that instead of small villages being pillaged by raids from a miscellaneous bandit clan, they're instead pillaged by an emperor. And while Suyin doesn't quite side with the chaos that Zahir himself attempted to create, she herself rules over Zaofu as more or less an autocrat, she's yet to offer a middle ground. Because there's a difference between the conditions of Zaofu and the conditions of the rest of the Earth Empire. Zaofu is wealthy and isolated, able to live independently and to allow its people to thrive in these conditions as people spend their free time on crafts and perfecting their metal bending. But so much of the rest of the Earth Kingdom is in chaos and struggling to make ends meet, so it's not a strange thing to see that they would choose bread and water over freedom or liberty. Idealism tends to fall by the wayside in favor of basic survival, and it takes a certain amount of stability before people are willing to accept loftier ideals. The Battle of Zaofu. Su and her twin sons attempt to take out Kuvira in the dead of night, only to wander into a trap and get captured. Kuvira uses this as proof that they violated the temporary truce called by Korra, and prepares to attack Zaofu. But Korra, Opal, and Jinora attempt to hold her off, only for Korra to realize that the Earth Emperor has no interest in listening to reason. Instead, she offers to have a one-on-one fight against the Avatar to prove her strength. One that Kuvira wins, as Korra is still incapable of using the Avatar state to the fullest extent. Jinora sends out a distress call to signal the other Airbenders to rescue them, and Kuvira is able to move in to conquer Zaofu without a long siege. Meanwhile, Varric volunteers Bolin as his new assistant as he's forced to work on the Spirit Vine weapon. But not wanting to go on without Zhu Li, he rigs the vines to explode the train with him on board. Batar Jr. evacuates the train under this threat, leaving Bolin and Varric behind in the incoming explosion, which Bolin rescues them from at the last moment. Once Batar Jr. returns to Zaofu with the rest of the troops, he convinces Zhu Li to work with him to recreate the experiment. So many times before, we've seen the series cover the emotional attachment that bending requires. People are able to bend their strongest when they have some sort of ideal that they're fighting for. A purely pragmatic attempt at fighting tends to be much less effective in the face of a person with convictions and ideals, something seen in the fight between Korra and Kuvira here, as Korra is still thoroughly on the fence about who's right and who's wrong, while Kuvira is more solid in her conviction. She knows what she's fighting for and why, and so she's able to beat the Avatar whose heart is not in it. But this emotional attachment to an ideal can also be a weakness, as a person starts to put too much of themselves into a cause, and they make poorer and poorer decisions in the interest of pursuing that cause. Kuvira is convinced she's doing the right thing, to the point that she's willing to overlook the cost at which she's buying her ideals. People who dissent are put into re-education camps, and anyone unwilling to go along with her is silenced, rather than having her ideals proven to them. A revolution done by force only lasts as long as that initial wave of stability does. Last episode I mentioned that people are willing to go along with an autocrat if it means they also get to eat. But once their stomachs are full, they finally get the privilege of deciding what kind of society they want to live in, which is why Su Yan thought a political assassination would have collapsed Kuvira's army. Reunion. Korra returns to Republic City and has a reunion dinner with Mako and Asami, with Prince Wu tagging along as he doesn't leave Mako's side. They argue a bit about the 3-year absence during the meal, until realizing that Wu's been missing for a while, discovering he's been kidnapped and taken out of the city. Korra uses her spirit powers on a nearby tree to track his location, and the trio breaks onto a train where he's being held, rescuing the boy and taking him to one of Asami's safe houses where Mako and Bolin's family have been staying. Meanwhile, Bolin and Varric have been fleeing their exile when they get captured by a group of refugees who have recently escaped one of Kuvira's prison camps, revealing that she sends non-Earthbenders there, as well as political dissidents. They threaten Bolin and Varric to bluff them through a military checkpoint, but the two are identified by a wanted poster and a fight breaks out, that Varric dissipates by setting up a makeshift EMP. After Bolin goes back to rescue the group, they thank them by allowing passage on a boat they've arranged to take them all up north. Before the episode ends, it cuts to Kuvira and Batar chopping down the swamp's banyan tree to gather more spirit vines. Book 4 starts out by showing us Kuvira's perspective on events through scenes with Bolin, allowing the audience to first sympathize with her cause by seeing the positive effects her rule is having on the people of the Earth Kingdom, who last season were left in chaos by Zahir's actions. By introducing the good she's doing first, it allows the audience to have the bad appear slowly over time, just as the characters themselves are learning about the cost of her actions. A group fleeing her re-education camps, which are being used as a punishment for dissidents, puts her actions and beliefs into a more historical perspective that the audience can identify from our world. But it's not just our world that can relate, but the Avatar-verse as well. Kuvira is intent on civilizing the Earth Kingdom and uniting the world under the guise of spreading progress, the exact justification that Sozin used in The Last Airbender for his invasion of the other nations. Considering that this mirrored plot comes about in a season following Korra's broken connections to her past lives, means that she won't be able to ask for direct guidance from Aang, who resolved the conflict the first time around. Though there are still those alive who saw that conflict end as well, meaning that the past connection isn't truly lost. Remembrances. 3 flashbacks of the series up to this point, the first told by Mako to Prince Wu, as the latter wants to learn more about his bodyguard's romantic history. The second is told between Asami and Korra, about Korra's doubts about her ability as the Avatar. The last is made up by Varrick, incorporating elements of the show up to that point, while changing details to make Bolin the main character. During production for Book 4, the showrunners were given a sudden ultimatum as a result of their budget being slashed. Either fire some of their animators, or cut one episode from production. As firing the animators was something they refused to do, a compromise was found by creating a recap episode that was almost entirely composed of reused assets and footage from the previous season, allowing The Legend of Korra to maintain its usual season length while also keeping the dedicated staff aboard the project through to the end. Beyond the Wilds. While on a tour of the spirit world, a group of tourists are attacked by the spirit vines and held in an unknown place. Following up on these reports, Jinora attempts to track down the source of the disturbance, only to be captured herself. So Korra works with Mako to find the missing people, only to get blocked by her inability to access the spirit world, as she merely flashes back to Zahir every time she tries. So she convinces the White Lotus to allow her access to Zahir's cell in order to conquer her fear of the man. While there, he guides her to the spirit world by having her allow the flashback to play out to completion, and she's finally able to free the captured souls. Meanwhile, a council between the other world leaders is held, where they discuss attacking Kuvira, though Tenzin and Izumi of the Air and Fire nations refuse to be the aggressor, and merely plan on shoring up their defenses. But Bolin and Varrick interrupt this meeting with news of Kuvira's potential superweapon, and Varrick is put in charge of creating a countermeasure alongside Asami. While this is happening, Bolin attempts to apologize to Opal, and when none of his attempts work, he's finally able to prove his love by agreeing to go along on a covert mission with Lin to rescue their family. Korra has spent the last 3 years running away from her past and the trauma inflicted by Zahir's poison, with the fix to her issues being to accept the events and focus on the future. This is keeping with the themes of change from so many past episodes, that being hung up on the past can be a block to moving forward and accepting change. Just like Tenzin trying to recreate the old age of the air nomads, or Unalaq trying to recreate the old age of spirituality, so many characters struggle to find a positive future for themselves as they're still not accepting of the things that caused that future to happen in the first place. But it's only through acknowledging and moving on from the past that one's able to live entirely in the present. This too is mirrored in the methods through which Kuvira has been conquering the Earth Empire. Rather than being hung up on the past and ignoring the present like so many others are, she instead focuses purely on the future. Her goal of a united world is a lofty but positive one. However, her insistence on creating this future regardless of cost causes the present atrocities in her empire to be ignored as she views them as reasonable. Though many others argue that the cost is far too high no matter what her end goals are. It ultimately comes down to the present alone that matters. The actual methods used to create a better tomorrow are the things that end up defining that age, rather than the ends justifying the means. Operation Beifong. Lin, Opal, and Bolin arrive at Zaofu to track their captured family, only to meet up with Toph, who tells them that the prisoners have been moved to a new location. This location doubles as the testing ground for Kuvira's new spirit weapon, which is nearing completion in spite of a few delays. When Kuvira learns that it's Julie sabotage that's causing these delays, she has her placed into the target town to be made an example of, causing the rescue effort to focus on her as well as the captured metal benders being held in a suspended cage underground. They're able to get their family out just in time to also delay the weapon from firing on the other rescue operation, resulting in a large-scale fight that Toph is able to bail them out of, though she laments that her old age is preventing her from doing any more than that. Once they're safe, Zhu Li warns the rest of the group that Kuvira is planning on using her weapon in 2 weeks, during an invasion of Republic City. In Republic City, Prince Wu volunteers to lead an evacuation effort of the civilian population, while Korra attempts to contact the spirits to see if they'll help to defend the city, though they reject her. During the planning phase of the rescue operation, Lin confronts Toph on the lack of a father figure in her life due to Toph's poor parenting, a resentment that's been present since the beginnings of Book 3. While it doesn't prevent the rescue from working perfectly, the resentment boiling over still requires that they talk it out and put the issue behind them, something done through cooperation in a different field, much in the same way that Bolin is able to make his peace with Opal by proving his valor in the rescue. It keeps with the themes this season, getting over older conflicts by focusing on the future instead of the past. Korra spends this episode trying to convince the spirits to assist in the fight against Kuvira, to which they agree that getting involved in a human war is not something for them to do. And yet this goes against the current shape of the conflict. Kuvira's already begun openly attacking the spirit vines throughout the physical world, and so whether or not they want to, the spirits are involved in this fight, much in the same way that the fight is being brought to the rest of the world. Just because it's not your fault you were dragged into a conflict doesn't mean it's not your responsibility to fix it. Kuvira's Gambit. Kuvira announces the next phase of her plan, to march on Republic City and to reclaim it as part of the Earth Empire, citing its original ownership. Team Avatar reunites and prepares to create a defense for this attack, including plans to disrupt the rail line that her superweapon was placed on. But while scouting, Korra finds that the weapon is now attached to a giant mech and that Kuvira is attacking a week earlier than their information indicated. With no counteroffensive for the spirit cannon, President Raiko surrenders to Kuvira upon her demonstration, so Korra sets out on her own to make a counteroffensive by kidnapping Baatar Jr. and holding him for information on how to take it out. After a failure to use threats and pleas from his family, Korra finally manages to crack the man by vowing to keep him and Kuvira separate forever, so he radios the Earth Emperor to ask her to stand down. Kuvira responds by tracing the radio signal and firing it at Team Avatar, nearly ending Baatar Jr. as she does so. Kuvira has always been shown as a pragmatist in the way that she operates, from her precise movements during fight scenes to her understanding of the way her invasion of the rest of the world might come across to other empires. This is how she's able to prevent a counteroffensive against her while uniting the kingdoms. She hasn't technically invaded any foreign land, so the foreign leaders never come to each other's aid until it's too late. But her goals and ambitions have always been viewed as more than what they truly are. People believe her goal of reuniting the Earth Kingdom's territory is something done out of a desire for peace, or spreading prosperity, or for whatever goals they themselves want to hear. But from the beginning, it has always been a desire for power. Everything else was only lip service to her real goal. It's not as though people create superweapons for defensive use. In the end, this pragmatism is what reveals itself to the people on the receiving end of it, that those with direct experience begin to understand her true motivations. Like Baatar Jr., who believes that Kuvira is capable of feeling love for him, only for her to fire the laser at his location upon learning that he's now a liability. Actions like these reveal that it was never about uniting an empire or bringing peace, but about controlling people whatever the cost. Day of the Colossus. Kuvira's Colossus is closing in on Republic City, indiscriminately firing on buildings. Prince Wu leads the evacuation efforts alongside Pima, who's calming the crowds down while Wu seeks out the badger-moles from the zoo to tunnel the last few evacuees out, after the Earth Empire cuts the lines. Meanwhile, the attempts to slow down the mech to buy enough time to come up with a plan to destroy it all come up short, from blinding the windows with paint bombs, to using a large tripwire and lava, to creating an EMP that can shut down the troops. Lin decides to free Hiroshi from prison to help with the brainstorming, and he works together with the Sami to create a small saw capable of cutting open the mech, so Team Avatar can destroy it from the inside. Varric proposes to Zhu Li, with the new couple forming one team, while Asami and Hiroshi form the other, manning the hummingbird mechs to create an opening for a boarding crew. But just before being smashed in the attempt, Hiroshi's able to eject Asami from the mech, finishing his cut and allowing Team Avatar to make their next play. The Last Stand. Team Avatar splits up, with Lin and Suyin going after the spirit cannon, Mako and Bolin attacking the engine room, and Korra going after Kuvira herself. Suyin's able to dismantle the reloading system while Lin covers for her, and upon realizing the cannon arm is now useless, Kuvira tears it off and throws the limb, sisters and all, across the city. Mako and Bolin attempt to shut off the engines, but find that Kuvira's done an override on the switch, so Mako stays behind to simply overload the device, getting pulled out of the ensuing explosion by his brother. This explosion causes the entire mech to be destroyed, as well as forming a crater in the middle of the city. Kuvira escapes into this crater and tracks down the cannon she tore off earlier, pointing it at Korra point blank in a last-ditch effort to vanquish her. But being in the presence of so many spirit vines, the cannon overloads and erupts, with Korra blocking the laser with spirit bending to save Kuvira's life so she can be taken into custody. After the battle, Varric and Julie celebrate their wedding together, Mako declares his loyalty to Korra, and Korra apologizes to Asami for spending so much time absent, but Asami's just happy to have her back, and the two decide to vacation together in the spirit world. A lot of the characters who have had their arc fulfilled by the end of the series seem to have gotten off very easily compared to the damage they've done and are still seemingly capable of doing. Varric starts a civil war but gets away with escaping prison and helping to build the weapon that destroyed most of the city, because he also helped to dismantle it. Hiroshi helped to arm a group of insurgents who planned on a hostile takeover, but is able to redeem himself by the end by sacrificing his life. Even Kuvira, who's been putting people into re-education camps, is implied to simply get away with an arrest, Korra intervening to ensure that she survives a blast from the weapon she designed and fired. And while most of these can be justified through the characters in question making active strides towards self-improvement, this also ties into the core message of the series, or at least what it seems to be, in that suffering builds character. Anytime a character undergoes some extreme negative moment, it's implied they'll come out even stronger, whether that's Wu living a life of luxury and being a bad leader up until the point that he finally gets a call to action and answers it. Or the way that Korra's struggle with her traumas has given her the strength to want to protect that same suffering from others, as much as the narrative also prescribes this backstory to Kuvira in the end. The point has consistently been made that growth is most often achieved whenever you suffer, that pain is simply the cost of self-improvement. So for these characters who have done seemingly irredeemable actions in the past, the suffering and punishment alone is what the narrative says will cause them not to repeat those mistakes. And of course, the main reason for suffering building character comes down to the other staple of the show's themes, that sympathy is what real strength is derived from. Korra starts out the series being hot-headed, and ultimately makes things worse when she charges in. Anytime a decision is made out of an intense temporary emotion, it's viewed negatively. But when a character suffers, they get a real urge to prevent whatever it was they went through from happening to anybody else. It took Korra going through 3 years of feeling weak to finally empathize with the weak, to empathize with the people she's meant to use her avatar strength to defend, so they don't have to go through what she did. Power without some kind of conviction behind it is a worthless thing, more likely to hurt people and yourself than to help. Finally, the episode ends with several mirrors to the ending of The Last Airbender, most notably in the relationship between Korra and Asami. This is something that's been built up since the beginning of the season, with Asami being the only person Korra felt comfortable opening up to during her hiatus. By having the final shot of the two be a reframing of the final shot between Aang and Katara, the message is clear that they're intended to be a couple by the finale, though holding hands was as far as any network would allow them to have shown at the time. But this is something that was confirmed after the fact as intentional by the showrunners themselves. Outro. There's a sense of irony to the legacy that The Legend of Korra has left on the world and the way that it mirrors the story of Korra herself. Many people who are eagerly anticipating the next installment in the Avatar franchise derided the character and story for being too far a departure from the original, that Korra was too unlike Aang. And this being a revisited aspect of Korra's characterization makes the theme more resonant. As Korra herself begins to doubt whether her actions as the Avatar were right to do, one can almost imagine the writers themselves feeling the doubt of a fanbase that wanted more of the same weighing on their decisions. But history has been kind to the series. It's probably worth understanding that the biggest critics of the show were likely people outside the intended audience, people who weren't planning on getting that invested anyway. If The Legend of Korra had simply tried to cash in on the nostalgia of The Last Airbender, then it would have had no lasting impact whatsoever, so that diversion from the usual was a necessity, in order for the series to say anything original or do anything different. And so despite being a sequel series, trying to view The Legend of Korra as anything but a standalone entry detracts from what makes it worthwhile, while getting hung up on comparisons to the past will usually only result in seeing whatever flaw you're hoping to see. It's unfortunate that any follow-up to a media work will always be viewed in comparison to the past, but that's just an aspect of writing that people will always have to work around. I don't like including definite conclusions in my videos, as I believe that any piece of media worth analyzing has far too much to say for any single paragraph to do it justice. But the biggest takeaway from The Legend of Korra ought to be its ability to take a piece of media that was lauded for the maturity of its subject matter while still being presentable to children, and following up on messages that an older audience would be able to parse properly, even when many adults still struggle to broach the subject. Anybody who appreciated the deeper themes of Avatar: The Last Airbender will go on to find a lot about The Legend of Korra to praise, and this is praise that is well deserved given the legacy that Korra had to live up to.